Wyoming, 1883. Gideon Hale had not slept well in 3 years. That wasn't a complaint he'd ever say out loud. He wasn't built for that kind of talking. But the evidence was written plainly enough on his face. The creases around his eyes ran deep, the kind that didn't come from sun alone. He was 41 years old and looked closer to 50, with the particular exhaustion of a man who had been fighting a slow war against everything at once, and losing just enough ground, every season, to never quite recover. The ranch was called Hale's Crossing, which was a name that had made more sense 20 years ago when his father, Dutch Hale, had built the first structure on this stretch of Wyoming plain, and people actually passed through on their way to somewhere else. Most of those people didn't pass through anymore. The railroad had shifted the route years back and the traffic dried up, and what was left was Gideon with 400 acres of dry grass, a cattle herd that was maybe 200 head on a generous count, a bunkhouse with 6 hands who stayed mostly out of loyalty or because they had nowhere better to go, and a main house that leaked in 3 places when it rained. He'd written to the agency in April. He wasn't proud of it. His neighbor Warren Fitch had done it 2 years back and gotten a perfectly sensible woman named Helen who could cook and sew, and had apparently transformed Warren's house into something that no longer looked like it was actively trying to collapse. Warren talked about it sometimes with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had solved a problem efficiently. Gideon figured it was the practical thing to do. He needed someone who could manage the domestic side of things. He was clear in the letter. He needed mending done. There was always mending. Curtains for the windows, some kind of order brought to the kitchen. Maybe a garden if she was inclined. He did not put anything romantic or sentimental in the letter because that wasn't how he thought about the arrangement. He was a practical man looking for a practical solution. He received a reply from one Clara Whitmore of Dayton, Ohio. Her letter was short. She told him she was 34 and had no family remaining, had been working in a canvas and sailcloth repair shop for 11 years, and was capable of hard work. She did not mention anything about cooking or curtains. He noticed that, and he told himself it didn't matter. Those things could be learned. And he sent back a letter agreeing to the arrangement. The stagecoach from Laramie came in on a Thursday afternoon, which was how Gideon found himself standing in front of the Borden Creek General Store with his hat in his hands, waiting. He had his 2 best hands with him, though he hadn't exactly explained why. Sam Pruitt, who was 26 and had been with the ranch 4 years, stood a few feet back pretending to examine a hitching post. Cole Dearborn, who was 50 and had been with the ranch since Gideon's father's time, and therefore felt he had certain rights of observation, stood openly and did not pretend to be doing anything except watching. "She might be ugly," Cole said, not unkindly. "That's not relevant," Gideon said. "I'm just saying men get ideas about these things, and then they—" "Cole, I'm being practical. So am I. Be quiet." The stagecoach came up the main road and settled in front of them in a cloud of dust that made everyone step back. The driver climbed down and opened the door, and 3 passengers got out. A heavy-set man in a brown suit who turned out to be a cattle buyer from Cheyenne, an older woman who was clearly going to the Borden Creek Millinery based on the way she immediately looked in that direction, and then a pause, and then Clara Whitmore. Gideon's first impression was that she was nothing like what he'd expected, though he couldn't have said precisely what he'd expected. She was medium height, with dark hair pinned back under a travel-worn hat, a plain gray dress that was clean but had clearly been mended multiple times, which he would only realize later was somewhat ironic. And she carried a large leather bag over one shoulder and a canvas roll under her other arm that was clearly tools of some kind, the shape of it unmistakable. She stepped down from the coach and looked around with the alert, slightly narrowed expression of someone taking inventory, and then her eyes found him. Probably because he was standing there holding his hat with the specific frozen look of a man who had just realized he had absolutely no idea how to do this. And she walked over. "Mr. Hale," she said. Not a question. "Miss Whitmore." He put his hat back on, which seemed like the right move. "Good journey?" "Long," she said. "The road from Laramie is rough." "It is." A silence. Cole was very visibly not being quiet in his whole body, even though he wasn't saying anything. "This is Cole Dearborn," Gideon said, because there was nothing else to do. "He's been with the ranch a long time, and Sam Pruitt." Clara nodded at both of them. Her gaze moved past them to the town, such as it was. The general store, the livery stable, the 2-story hotel that was also the saloon, the millinery, the land office, and Victor Crow's supply and hardware establishment, which was the largest building on the street and had Crow's name painted on it in letters about a foot tall. Small town, she said. Gets bigger in summer, Gideon said. Settlers come through. She seemed to be doing something in her head, calculating something. Then she looked at him directly. I should tell you something before we go anywhere. He waited. Your letter mentioned mending and curtains. It did. I can mend, she said. I'm very good at mending, but I should be honest with you. The kind of mending I've done for the past 11 years is not curtains. I worked with heavy canvas, wagon covers, harness leather, tarpaulins, that kind of thing. I can put a curtain together, but it won't be elegant. If that's a problem, you should know it now. Gideon looked at her for a moment. Cole had made a small sound that Gideon chose to ignore. Can you cook? Gideon asked. Adequately, Clara said. I won't poison you. That's the main requirement. There was a flicker of something across her face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one that she appeared to decide against. Then I think we're fine, she said. The ride out to Haley's Crossing took about 40 minutes in the wagon. Clara sat in the front bench next to Gideon and looked at the landscape. He watched her do it from the corner of his eye. She wasn't looking at it the way most women he'd seen look at Wyoming looked at it, which was with either alarm or exhausted resignation. She was looking at it the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand. How many cattle? She asked after about 10 minutes of quiet. 200, give or take. Lose many to weather? Some. We had a bad winter 2 years back. Wolves? Some. She nodded. He noticed she was watching the fence line as they passed it, and something in her expression wasn't right. He almost asked what she was thinking, but then they hit a rut in the road and the wagon lurched and the moment passed. When they came over the low rise and the ranch spread out below them, the main house, the bunkhouse, the barn, the corrals, she was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. It needs work, Gideon said finally, because he'd rather say it than have her say it. Yes, she agreed. What's the most urgent problem? The roof on the... He stopped. Why? Because if I'm going to help, Clara said simply, I'd rather know what's actually broken than assume. He looked at her for a moment. The barn roof is the worst, then the lean-to on the south side, then probably the bunkhouse floor. What about equipment? Wagons? Tarps? Saddle rigging? Why are you asking about equipment? Because those things hemorrhage money when they're in bad repair, she said. You replace what could be fixed, or you lose supplies because your covers leak, or a saddle breaks at the wrong moment and you've got a horse and rider down. She paused. I'm not criticizing. I'm trying to understand what I'm working with. He didn't say anything to that. Sam, riding alongside, exchanged a look with Cole. Cole's expression was impossible to read, which was normal for Cole. The other ranch hands got their first look at Clara Whitmore at supper that evening. There were 6 of them, Sam and Cole, who'd been in town, plus Tom Wicker, who was 22 and had a habit of talking too much when he was nervous, Davy Oakes, who was 40 and missing part of his left ear from a cattle incident he'd never fully explained, young Pete Ruiz, who was 18 and from New Mexico and still visibly surprised by Wyoming winters, and old Carl Steffens, who had worked for Dutch Hale and stayed on for Gideon and didn't say much but noticed everything. Clara cooked. The food was exactly as she'd advertised, adequate. The biscuits were edible. The beans were well seasoned. The beef was tough because the beef was always tough, and she appeared to understand that because she didn't apologize for it. Tom Wicker, who could not read a room to save his life, said, Warren Fitch's wife makes apple pie. There was a silence. I saw an apple tree by the east pasture fence, Clara said, without heat. If it's bearing fruit this season, I can make a pie. Tom opened his mouth again and Sam kicked him under the table. Carl Steffens, who had not spoken yet, looked up from his plate and looked at Clara with an evaluating expression that he usually reserved for horses and weather fronts. He said, You really a seamstress? I do repair work, Clara said. Canvas, leather, heavy-duty fabrics. Carl nodded slowly. This seemed to mean something to him that wasn't immediately clear to the others. After supper, while the hands dispersed and Gideon sat at the table with the accounts, which he did every evening, a nightly ritual of confirming that the numbers were exactly as bad as he remembered, Clara cleared the plates, and then, instead of retiring, she unrolled the canvas bundle she'd brought and spread it on the other end of the table. It was a set of tools: long needles, awls, several types of thread wound around wooden spools, a pair of heavy shears, a curved palm needle, a wood-handled punch. All of it worn with use but well kept, organized in a way that showed they were used regularly and put back with care. Gideon looked at the tools, then at her. "I'd like to see the equipment tomorrow morning," she said without looking up. "If that's all right." "What equipment specifically?" "All of it, if you'll let me." He didn't answer right away. He was looking at her hands. She was running her thumb along the edge of one of the needles, checking it by feel, the kind of automatic gesture that belongs to someone who's been doing a particular thing for a very long time. "Fine," he said, after first light. What she found the next morning did not surprise her, though it might have surprised Gideon to know that. The ranch's equipment was in a state of progressive, expensive decay. Not catastrophic, nothing had completely failed yet, but the kind of systematic deterioration that happens when maintenance gets deferred repeatedly until the deferred problems start to pile up like unpaid debts. The main wagon had a cover that had been patched 3 times in different places with different materials, none of which matched the original canvas in weight or weave. The patches were holding, barely, but the seam along the left side had begun to separate, and another Wyoming storm, and Wyoming had storms, would split it open. The 2 smaller freight wagons had covers that were worse. One of them had a section near the rear that had rotted through from water intrusion and been covered with what appeared to be part of a feed sack, stitched on with thread that was entirely wrong for outdoor exposure. The saddles were better. Somebody had been oiling them, but 2 of the harness pieces had cracked leather at the stress points, the kind of thing that doesn't matter until it does matter, which is always at the worst possible moment. The grain storage bags were a particular problem. There were 16 of them, and 4 had holes. The holes had been tied shut with rope. Grain was leaking through the rope knots. It was a slow leak, the kind you don't notice day to day, but Clara did a quick mental calculation and reckoned that over a season, those 4 bags alone were losing a meaningful fraction of their contents. She found Gideon in the barn doing something to a fence post with a mallet. "How much do you spend on replacement canvas in a year?" she asked. He turned around. "What?" "Replacement canvas, new wagon covers, new tarps, new grain bags." He thought about it. "Last year, probably $30, $40. And before that?" "Similar." "What about harness leather? Replacements?" "Maybe $20. She nodded. "I can fix most of what you have. The wagon covers, the harness pieces, the grain bags. It'll take a few weeks of solid work, but once it's done, you'll stop bleeding that money." Gideon set down the mallet. "You're telling me you can fix all of it." "I'm telling you most of it isn't as far gone as it looks. The materials are still structurally sound. They just need the right repairs with the right materials, done correctly." She paused. "The feed sack stitching on the second freight wagon is going to fail in rain. That's urgent." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not skepticism, exactly. More like he was revising something in his head and wasn't sure yet what it should be revised to. "All right," he said, "I'll need some supplies. Heavy-duty wax thread, more sail needles if you have them. Linseed oil for the leather. There's a supply shop in town. Crow's. I'll make a list." She made the list, and Gideon took it to Crow's that afternoon, which was how the first small friction began, though neither of them understood at the time that it was the beginning of anything. Victor Crow was 53, well-fed, and had the practiced ease of a man who had been the most important merchant in a small town for long enough that he had stopped being fully aware of it as something he worked to maintain. His store occupied the best corner on Borden Creek's main street and sold everything from canned goods to farm equipment, and he had a particular sideline in canvas and replacement parts for wagons and farm equipment, because settlers needed those things, and there was nowhere else within a full day's ride to get them. He read the list Gideon handed him with a small frown. "Heavy wax linen thread," he said, "sail needles, linseed oil in a quantity." He looked up. "This is repair work." "That's right." "I carry replacement wagon covers," Crow said. "New ones. Better than patching, honestly. A patched cover is still a patched cover." "She says the covers can be repaired." Crow handed the list back with the easy manner of a man sharing wisdom rather than making an argument. Your call, Hale. But I've seen a lot of frontier repairs that failed at the worst time. Sometimes replacement is the wiser investment. Gideon looked at him. Crow's expression was helpful and mild. I'll take the supplies, Gideon said. Crow shrugged and got the supplies. Word got around Borden Creek that Gideon Hale's mail-order bride had arrived and was, depending on who was telling it, either strange or unusual, or both. The particular detail that circulated most was that she'd brought tools and had spent her first morning at the ranch examining the equipment rather than the house. Mabel Oates, who ran the millinery and knew everything that happened in Borden Creek within 48 hours of its happening, relayed this to Ruth Granger at the post office, who told her husband, who mentioned it to two other men at the saloon that evening. By the time the story had traveled its natural circuit, it had acquired a mild comic quality that it didn't entirely deserve. The general verdict, delivered with the particular confidence of people who have never had to solve the problem being discussed, was that Gideon Hale had gotten a strange one. Clara was not unawares of this. Small towns communicated through the body language of their residents, the extra-long looks from women on the street, the way conversation in the general store paused when she walked in. She had lived in a small city, not a town, but the basic mechanism was the same. People were deciding what to make of her, and they were doing it before they had enough information to make any real determination. She did not find it particularly troubling. She had been decided about in advance before, and it had never been especially accurate, either in her favor or against it. What she focused on instead was the second freight wagon cover, which she'd identified as the most urgent repair. She took it down the morning after Gideon got the supplies, spread it on the flat ground outside the barn, and got to work. The bad patchwork near the rear had to come out first. Whoever had done it, she suspected it was Tom Wicker based on the general quality of the work, though she'd never said so, had used a running stitch that was fine for light fabric and completely wrong for load-bearing canvas. In a wind, it would pull apart. She used a seam ripper to remove it carefully, preserving the surrounding canvas, and examined what was underneath. The rot was more contained than it appeared from the outside. The feed sack had protected the underlying canvas from further moisture damage, even while failing in its actual function, which was mildly impressive. The real damage was a roughly hand-sized hole and about 8 inches of weakened edge canvas on the left. She cut the weakened section back to sound material, measured twice, cut a matching section from the roll of spare canvas she'd had the foresight to bring with her, and began to sew. Sam Pruitt came out to water the horses around mid-morning and stopped to watch for a minute. That's the repair? He said. Part of it, Clara said without stopping. Looks like a lot of work. It is. He was quiet for a moment, watching her hands. She was using a palm needle, pushing through 3 layers of canvas, her movements steady and economical. Will it hold? Better than the original seam in that section, Clara said. Factory canvas seams aren't always as strong as people assume. The thread degrades over time. A properly done field repair with the right materials can outlast the original. Sam considered this. Tom's the one who patched it the first time, he said, with the mildly guilty air of someone reporting something that is true but slightly disloyal. I know, Clara said. He used what we had. I understand that. It's not a criticism. It just needed to be done differently. Sam nodded and went on with the horses. What? The repair took the better part of 2 days. When she was done, she sealed the seam with a thin coating of linseed oil, which would help weatherproof it, and let it dry in the sun. Then she moved to the grain bags. Gideon watched her work on the grain bags that evening, leaning against the barn door with a cup of coffee, not asking questions, just watching. She had a particular rhythm when she worked, not fast exactly, but uninterrupted, like water moving downhill, finding the efficient line through each problem without having to stop and reconsider. The rope knot solution, she said without looking up. That was my idea, he said after a pause. I know. I figured it was either you or Cole, and Cole would have used leather. Gideon didn't say anything. It kept the grain from all going at once, she added. That was the right instinct. It just needed a proper follow-up. He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him deciding whether this was a compliment or something else. You're very direct, he said finally. Is that a problem? No, he said. My wife was very direct. He said it without apparent emotion, just as a fact, and then seemed to realize it had sounded like something, and added, She died 6 years ago. Fever. I'm sorry, Clara said. She would have liked you, he said, with a certainty that surprised him more than her. She was practical, too. Clara looked up at that. Not because it was sentimental, but because it was honest, and honesty from a man who seemed constitutionally reluctant to offer it felt like something worth noting. She didn't say anything back, just held the moment for a second, and then returned to the grain bag in her hands. She finished the grain bags in 3 days, then the harness leather. Then she turned back to the other wagon covers. The ranch hand's attitude adjusted gradually, the way attitudes in working environments usually do, not through a single moment of conversion, but through the accumulation of small evidence. Tom Wicker was the first to ask her directly for help. He'd torn the pocket of his work coat clean off in a way that seemed impossible, but had apparently involved a fence wire and an unexpected horse movement, and he brought the coat to her with the specific sheepishness of someone expecting to be judged. She repaired it in 20 minutes, reinforcing the pocket attachment point while she was at it, and handed it back without commentary. Tom said, "Thank you, ma'am," and then stood there for an extra second, clearly wanting to say something else. "Tom," she said. "Yeah?" "You were the one who stitched the feed sack to the wagon cover." His face did several things quickly. Yeah, I know it wasn't the best." "The instinct was right," she said. "You had a problem, you found a material close at hand, you kept water off the cargo. That's frontier repair thinking. The technique just needed adjustment. I'll show you if you want." Tom looked at her. He was 22 and not always the most self-aware person in a room, but he understood when something was being offered to him in good faith. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that." Section. 2 weeks after Clara's arrival, she had repaired both freight wagon covers, all 4 grain bags, 2 saddle harness pieces, 3 tent sections from the storage shed that nobody had even told her about, and a leather apron belonging to Carl Steffens that had 3 separate tiers, and which Carl had clearly decided was too far gone to bother with. Carl came to find his apron the morning after she'd repaired it, and stood looking at it for a long time. "You found it in the shed," he said. "It was with the other leather goods," she said. "I hope that's all right." "You didn't have to do that." "I was already set up," Clara said. "It didn't take long." Carl nodded slowly. He put the apron on. The repairs were nearly invisible. She'd matched the leather color well and used a welt stitch that laid flat. He ran his fingers over one of the repaired sections. "My wife gave me this," he said. "She's been gone 8 years." "Then it's worth keeping properly," Clara said. Carl looked at her with an expression that was difficult to parse and said nothing else. But from that day on, he was the most reliably helpful of the ranch hands when she needed something moved or fetched or held steady while she worked. Gideon had been tallying the months from a habit of accounting rather than hope for a long time. He sat down with his ledger at the end of Clara's 3rd week at the ranch and tried to calculate what the repairs had saved. It was not a precise calculation. He was working from rough costs and estimates, but the shape of it was clear enough. The grain bags alone had stopped a loss he'd been absorbing for at least 2 seasons without clearly identifying. The wagon covers, properly waterproofed now, would last considerably longer before needing replacement. The harness repair had cost him a few dollars in materials versus the 30 or 40 the equivalent new harness pieces would have run. The total was not dramatic, but it was real, and it was accumulating. He found her after supper, as had become something of a pattern, her working by lantern light at the table while he reviewed accounts. He'd stopped apologizing for the accounting work at the same table. She didn't seem to mind, and he'd gradually understood that she was often working on similar calculations in her own head. "I went over the ledger," he said. "And?" She didn't look up from the harness piece she was stitching. "The repairs are saving money." "I know. More than I expected." She set down the harness piece and looked at him. "How much are you short on the operating costs for this year?" The question landed with a specificity that told him she'd been paying attention to more than he'd assumed. He looked at her for a long moment. "About $300 before winter expenses." Clara nodded. "What if I could bring in work from outside the ranch?" "What do you mean?" "Settlers come through," she said. They have the same problems you have, but they're moving, which means they can't defer repairs. They need their wagon covers fixed, their harness mended, their equipment functional. I know this valley isn't heavy traffic, but the summer settler season is coming. If word got around that there was someone in the area doing quality repair work, Gideon leaned back in his chair and looked at her. You're talking about running a business out of the ranch. A small one, a supplemental income. What does that do to the workload here? I can manage both. The ranch repairs are mostly caught up. I'm maintaining now, which is lighter work. I'd need a proper workspace. The area by the south wall of the barn would work, if you don't mind me using it. He was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about this since the second day, she said simply. He looked at her again. This direct, practical, entirely unexpected woman who had arrived with a canvas roll of tools and immediately started calculating what was broken and what it would cost to fix it. He thought about what he'd written in the letter to the agency. He thought about what he'd expected, which was someone competent and agreeable who would manage the domestic side of things. He thought about how badly he'd understood what he needed. All right, he said, use the south wall. The first outside customers arrived about 2 weeks later. A family named Soren, passing through on their way north. Their main wagon cover so badly split along the crown seam that they'd rigged a stretch of painted oilcloth over the gap as a temporary measure. They'd heard about Clara at Borden Creek's general store, where Gideon's ranch hand Sam had mentioned in passing that there was a woman out at Hales Crossing who did canvas repair work and was good at it. The Sorens were a husband, wife, 3 children, and a grandmother who sat in the wagon bed and said nothing but watched everything. Carl Soren shook Gideon's hand at the gate, explained the problem, and looked faintly uncomfortable about the fact that the repair person who came out to look at the wagon was a woman. Clara walked around the wagon once. She pulled back the oilcloth and examined the split seam. 3 days, she said. I need to reinforce the whole crown, not just the split. If I just fix the split, it'll fail again in the next strong wind. Carl Soren looked at his wife. His wife looked at Clara with an expression of someone recognizing a professional. How much? Carl asked. Clara named a price that was fair rather than cheap. Carl hesitated, and his wife said quietly, Carl, just say yes. They camped at the edge of the Hales Crossing property for 3 days. On the 3rd morning, Clara had the cover back on the wagon and walked Carl Soren through what she'd done and why. Because she'd found over the years that people took better care of repaired equipment when they understood the repair. Carl ran his hand along the crown seam. This is solid work, he said, with the specific tone of a man who'd expected to be confirmed in a skepticism and found it unexpectedly contradicted. It should last several more years with care, Clara said. Keep it dry between uses where you can, and if you see any thread fraying at the north edge, address it before it spreads. Carl nodded. He paid. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but couldn't figure out the right shape for it, so he just paid and shook her hand and climbed up on the wagon. His wife, as they were leaving, leaned out over the wagon side and said, Thank you, I mean that. Safe travels, Claire said. She watched the wagon go and then turned back to the workspace, and the next thing that needed doing, and did not mark the moment as particularly significant because she had learned, in 11 years of work, that small things rarely announce themselves as the beginnings of larger ones. But Carl Steffens had been watching from near the barn, and he said to Cole Dearborn that evening, in a tone that settled the question of what he thought of the whole situation, That woman knows what she's doing. Cole, who had formed his own view somewhat earlier, said, I know it. By the end of the summer's first month, 3 more settler families had stopped at Hales Crossing. Word traveled the way word traveled on the frontier, in pieces, passed along at way stations and general stores and camping grounds, gaining precision as it went. The woman at Hales Crossing, good repair work, reasonable price. It wasn't a flood, but it was steady. Gideon noticed things beginning to shift in the way the hands talked about the ranch, or rather, in the way they didn't talk about it with the particular flatness that had characterized conversations about the ranch's prospects for years. That particular quality of men who are working for something they no longer quite believe in was beginning to change, replaced with something more ordinary and specific. Sam helped Clara build a proper work table along the south barn wall without being asked. Davy Oakes started keeping an eye on incoming travelers at the road and would come find Clara when he spotted a wagon that looked like it might need work. Pete Ruiz, who had the youngest eyes, got appointed the unofficial watch for distant approaching visitors. Tom Wicker, for his part, had taken Clara up on her offer and had 3 genuine lessons in canvas repair, during which he'd proven to have a real aptitude for it that surprised him and didn't particularly surprise Clara. She had a theory that most people were capable of more specific skill than they'd been given the chance to develop, and Tom was one piece of evidence for it. The distance between Gideon and Clara, which had been the formal, careful distance of 2 strangers who have entered a practical arrangement, was diminishing by increments that neither of them was fully tracking. It happened through supper conversations that started about the ranch and ended somewhere else. Through the particular comfortable silence that develops between people who are used to working near each other without filling all the space with talk. Through the moment, on a windy evening in late June, when a gust caught one of the repaired wagon covers that she'd put out to air and sent it skidding across the yard, and both of them ran for it at the same moment and arrived at it together, breathing hard and slightly ridiculous, and both laughed, which was the first time either of them had done that since her arrival. He told her that night about his daughter, Emma, who had died with her mother in the fever year. He told her about Dutch Hale, his father, who had built this ranch from nothing and had been so certain of its future that the certainty had felt like a structural feature of the landscape. He told her about the years after, when the certainty was gone but the land remained, and what it was like to keep working something you'd lost faith in because you didn't know how to do anything else. Clara listened without trying to fix it, which was not as natural for her as it would have been for most people, but she understood when a thing was being said and not asked. When he was done, she said, "The ranch has good bones." He looked at her. "It's not a metaphor," she said. "The land is genuinely good. The problem was never the land." "No," he agreed. "The problem was me, for a while. And then the problem was money, and they're related. They usually are." He looked out at the dark yard, the outline of the barn, the south wall where her workspace was. "You've changed something here," he said. "I don't know exactly how to say it." "You don't have to," she said. "I want to." He was quiet for a moment. "I wrote that letter to the agency because I thought I needed someone to manage the house. I thought that was the problem." He shook his head. "I didn't know what I was asking for. I don't think I knew what I needed." Clara looked at him. She had come to Wyoming without many expectations, which was not quite the same as having no hope, but was the practical armor worn by a woman who had been on her own long enough to be cautious. She had expected to work hard. She had not expected to feel, at the end of a month, as though she might be in the right place. "The curtains," she said. He blinked. "What?" "Your letter mentioned curtains." She paused. "I'll make some, properly, when there's time." Gideon Hale looked at her for a moment with an expression that was mixed enough that she couldn't fully read it, and then he said, "There's no rush." "I know," she said, "but I'll make them anyway." Outside, the Wyoming plain ran all the way to the dark horizon, flat and enormous and indifferent to the small lights in the windows of a ranch house where 2 practical people were, with some difficulty and no particular grace, beginning to trust each other. The curtains could wait. The work couldn't. The curtains never did get made that summer, but neither of them brought it up again. There was too much else. July came in hot and dry, the kind of Wyoming heat that sits on the plain like something with weight to it, baking the grass yellow and turning the creek down past the east pasture to a thin, grudging trickle. Gideon moved the cattle to the north pasture where the shade was better and the ground held a little more moisture. And Clara moved her workspace outside entirely because the south wall of the barn caught the morning light in a way that let her see what she was doing without burning through lamp oil. She had, by that point, established a rhythm that the ranch had simply absorbed, the way a working place absorbs any consistent presence that proves useful. She was up before the hands most mornings, had coffee made before Gideon came in from checking the water troughs, and was at her workspace by the time the light was good enough to thread a needle. She worked until the heat became impractical around midday, shifted to lighter indoor tasks, harness oiling, tool maintenance, the inevitable mending that accumulated from 6 working men and a ranch that used everything it had, and then returned to the heavy canvas work in the late afternoon when the sun dropped enough to work outside again without squinting. The hands had stopped noticing her presence as a novelty and started treating her as part of the operation, which was, in its way, a more significant development than any deliberate acceptance would have been. Tom Wicker brought his repair problems to her first before attempting fixes of his own, which was a genuine improvement in outcomes. Davy Oakes had taken to leaving any torn or worn equipment near her workspace rather than in the general pile, a small organizational decision that saved her considerable sorting time. Pete Ruiz, who was quiet and observant in the way that young men sometimes are when they're in a new place and taking everything in, started asking her questions, careful, specific questions, about technique, about materials, about how she knew what was repairable and what wasn't. "You can usually tell by the way it failed," she told him one afternoon, holding a section of torn saddle skirt up to the light. "If the material tore along a stress line, here, see how this follows the fold? The material's still sound. It just couldn't handle that specific load. But if you see breakdown along the grain, fibers coming apart even where there's no obvious stress, that's age or rot or bad material to begin with, that you can't really fix, not long term." Pete looked at the torn skirt, trying to see what she was seeing. "How do you learn which is which?" "You look at a lot of failures," Clara said. "There's no shortcut for it." Pete nodded, the way he nodded when he was filing something away for later. The outside work had grown steadily enough by mid-July that Clara had started keeping a simple ledger of her own. Not complex. She was not a trained accountant, but functional. Who brought what? What materials she used, what she charged, what was outstanding. The numbers were small but consistent, and consistency was what mattered on the frontier more than size. She showed it to Gideon one evening, not because she had to, but because she thought he should see it. He looked at the ledger for a long time. She'd noticed that he read figures carefully, giving them the kind of attention that people give things they've learned to distrust. Not dismissive, but thorough. He ran his finger down the column of amounts paid. $63 since June, he said. 67, as of yesterday. The Halloran family brought in a tent yesterday afternoon. Gideon set the ledger down and looked at her. "That's not nothing." "No," Clara said. "It's not enough to solve anything on its own, but it's not nothing." "You're keeping track of the materials costs separately?" "Yes. The margin is reasonable. Better than I expected, actually, because most of what I need I ordered in bulk once I understood the volume, so the per-unit cost is lower." He absorbed this. "You ordered in bulk. From a supplier in Cheyenne. Crow's prices are... they're what they are." She paused. "I should tell you, I didn't go through Crow's for the second order." Gideon's expression shifted, just slightly. "He notice?" "Probably. He mentioned something to Sam last week about settlers bypassing local merchants for mail-order goods. That's not specifically about you." "No," Clara said, "but it's not about me either." Gideon turned that over. Victor Crow was not a man he thought about often, but he was a man Gideon thought about carefully when the occasion arose. Crow had been the dominant commercial presence in Borden Creek for nearly 15 years. Long enough that his interests and the town's interests had become somewhat blurred in people's minds, and Crow himself appeared to encourage this blurring when it suited him. "Don't worry about Crow," Gideon said. Clara looked at him. "I'm not worried about him," she said. "I just think you should know." It was a fine distinction, and he recognized it as such. Not fear, just information, given plainly, the way she gave most things. He picked up his coffee and said, "All right." The reputation, as reputations do, traveled further than the people who made it. In early August, a woman named Dorothea Marsh appeared at the ranch gate on a Monday morning with 2 grain bags, a wagon tarp folded under her arm, and the specific determined expression of someone who has already had an argument in their head about whether to come and won it. She was maybe 45, weathered in the way of women who work outside, and she'd come from a homestead about 8 miles north. She introduced herself to Clara with a handshake that was more businesslike than social. "Margaret Fitch told me about you," Dorothea said. "Warren Fitch's wife." "I don't think I've met her," Clara said. "She heard from someone in town. She said you do good work." Dorothea set the grain bags down and held up the tarp. "My husband keeps saying we need new. I keep saying this one can be fixed. He says no woman can fix a canvas tarp properly, which is why I came here." She said it flatly, Not as a complaint, but as a simple accounting of the situation. Clara looked at the tarp. She opened it, ran her hand along the damaged sections, checked the seam integrity. "He's wrong," she said, "about the tarp and about the other thing." Dorothea's expression didn't change, but something in her posture settled. "How long?" 2 days for the tarp. The grain bags are an hour each, maybe less. "My husband will want to know the price." Clara named it. Dorothea nodded once, the way a person nods when a number matches what they calculated on the road. "I'll come back Thursday," Dorothea said. When she'd gone, Pete, who'd been within earshot near the water trough, said, "She rode 8 miles for that?" "People ride a long way for work they trust," Clara said. Bond. Dorothea Marsh came back Thursday, as promised, paid without negotiation, and examined the repaired tarp with a thoroughness that was clearly intended to produce an accurate report for home. She tested the seams, checked the patches, held it up to the light in the same way Clara had taught Tom Wicker to check canvas integrity, though Dorothea arrived at the technique herself by instinct. "This is good," she said. "Thank you. My husband is going to say you probably used inferior materials. He's welcome to examine it himself." Dorothea looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of appreciation. "He won't come. He doesn't like being wrong in front of people." She folded the tarp. "I told my neighbor Ellen about you. She has a situation with a wagon cover. I think she'll come by." "The gate's open," Clara said. Ellen did come, the following week, with her daughter. After that came a man named Porter with a badly damaged saddle and enough skepticism in his expression to fuel a small fire, which Clara addressed by doing the work in front of him, explaining each step in technical terms that were accurate rather than simplified, and which had the effect of converting his skepticism into the specific approval of a man who understands a craft when he sees it properly executed. Porter told someone that someone told someone else. The south wall of the barn, which had been a bare stretch of wall with a table leaned against it, became a workspace with a proper table, a rack of tools, organized material storage, and, on the best days, 2 or 3 jobs in various stages of completion laid out in the order they needed to be done. Gideon watched it grow the way he'd been watching the ranch's other numbers his entire adult life, with the careful attention of a man who's been burned enough times by optimism to be suspicious of good news until it repeats itself. But it was repeating itself. Week by week, the outside work was steady. What he hadn't entirely anticipated was what it was doing to the hand's relationship with the ranch itself. Something had changed in the bunkhouse, in the particular quality of conversation at the supper table, in the way the men talked about the operation. It was hard to quantify, and he wasn't entirely sure he understood it, but Cole, who understood group dynamics the way old men sometimes do after decades of watching them, put it plainly one evening when the two of them were checking fence on the east pasture. "Place feels different," Cole said. "Different how? Like it's going somewhere." Cole shifted in the saddle. "Before it felt like we were just keeping it from falling. Now it feels like we're building something." He paused. "That's her." "The repairs save money." "It's not the money," Cole said. "Or it's not only the money. It's that she came in here and looked at all the broken things and didn't throw up her hands. She just got to work. Men notice that. They start doing the same." He looked at Gideon steadily. "You've noticed it too." Gideon didn't answer for a moment, then, "I have." "She's good for this place, Gideon. I know it. I mean beyond the practical," Cole said, and then, with the tact of a man who knows when he's said enough, turned his horse and rode on. Clara had her own difficulties. Not at the ranch. The ranch had found its accommodation with her. The difficulties came from the town side, in the form of looks and comments that arrived at her indirectly, the way that kind of thing usually does. She heard most of it through Sam, who was young enough to find the social dynamics of Borden Creek less legible than they actually were, and would therefore relay what he'd heard without fully understanding why she might want to know it. The widow Cantor at the boarding house had said that Gideon Hale had been sold a bill of goods. 2 men at the saloon had made a bet about how long she'd last before Gideon sent her back. Victor Crow had said, to at least 3 people Clara knew of, that the repair work she was doing was the kind of patch-up job that looked fine until weather hit it, and that the settlers trusting her work were taking a risk they didn't fully understand. That last one was the one worth paying attention to because Crow was not a stupid man, And a man saying something like that wasn't only saying it once to 3 people by accident. She mentioned it to Gideon on a Wednesday evening when they were both at the table after supper. He with accounts, she with a saddle skirt that needed reglazing. "Crow's telling people my repairs are unsafe," she said. Gideon set down his pencil. "Where'd you hear that?" "Sam. And one of the settler women mentioned it, said someone at the store had told her the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll talk to him." "Don't," Clara said. "He's spreading a lie." "I know he is, but if you go talk to him, it becomes your fight with him, and it gives the lie more weight than it has. The way to beat a rumor like that is to keep doing good work." She paused. "What he's saying is that I can't do this properly because I'm a woman. The answer to that is not an argument, it's more work." Gideon looked at her across the table. She had stopped working on the saddle skirt and was looking at him with the direct expression he'd come to understand was her serious face. Not angry, not performative, just clear. "That's a patient approach," he said. "I'm a patient person when I need to be." He picked his pencil back up. "All right, your call." "It's my reputation," she said simply, and went back to the saddle skirt. Her patience was tested in specific form on the second Friday of August, when she was working at the bench, and 2 women from Borden Creek stopped by the ranch on their way somewhere else, ostensibly to check on Mabel Oates' sister who lived down the road. Though Hale's Crossing was not precisely on that route. They were Ruth Granger and a woman named Bess Mallory, who Clara had seen at the general store twice. They were polite. They were also doing that thing where they looked at the workspace with an expression that combined curiosity and mild concern, as though they were visiting a neighbor who had taken up an odd hobby that might not be entirely respectable. Ruth said, "You must miss having proper women's work." Clara looked up from the canvas section she was reinforcing. "What would that be?" Ruth seemed slightly thrown. "Well, sewing, cooking, household things." "I sew," Clara said, gesturing at the table. "Of course, but proper sewing, dressmaking, embroidery." "I've never done embroidery," Clara said. "I don't miss it." Bess, who was perhaps more perceptive than Ruth, shifted the conversation. "It must be difficult work, though, physically." "Some days." "For a woman," Bess added, and then seemed to hear herself and look slightly uncomfortable. Clara set down the canvas section. She was not angry. She had learned, over many years of doing work that people had opinions about, that getting angry at the opinion rarely changed it, and she was not particularly interested in the opinions of people who hadn't watched her work. But she was tired, and being tired made her more direct than she might otherwise have been. "Mrs. Mallory," she said, "I've been doing this for 11 years. The tarp that's keeping the Marsh family's feed dry right now was repaired by my hands last week. The Soren family's wagon that made it through the summer storms intact, that's my work on the crown seam. I do it because I'm good at it, and it needs doing, not despite being a woman or because of it." She picked up the canvas section again. "I appreciate you stopping by." Ruth and Bess exchanged a glance. Ruth started to say something, and Bess put a light hand on her arm, and they went on their way. Tom Wicker, who had witnessed this from a discreet distance, came to find Clara an hour later with 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her without comment. "Thank you, Tom," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went back to work. The Halloran family, who Clara had repaired a tent for in early July, came back in August with more work. 2 wagon covers and a collection of leather straps that were in such poor condition that Clara spent 20 minutes explaining to Mr. Halloran why 6 of them couldn't be repaired, only replaced, which was a conversation she always found uncomfortable but necessary. "Crow's been saying your work fails in weather," Mr. Halloran said, not accusatorially, but in the way of a man making sure he has the full picture before he commits. "What he's been saying," Clara said, "is that repair work in general fails in weather. That's true if it's done badly. It's not true if it's done right." "How do I know it's done right?" She showed him. She walked him through the Soren wagon cover repair. She'd followed up with the Sorens and knew it had held through 2 significant rainstorms and a period of sustained wind, and the marsh tarp, and several other repairs she had documentation on because she'd started keeping records specifically for this reason. Halloran looked at the records, looked at the repaired items she showed him, and appeared to arrive at a conclusion. "Crow's been selling us replacement covers for 6 years, he said, with the meditative tone of someone doing arithmetic. "That's between you and him," Clara said. No, it's between me and my money. He shook Gideon's hand, shook Clara's hand, the handshake with Clara being slightly more deliberate than might normally be the case, and left his wagon covers. Silent. The money was building, not fast, not the kind of growth that announced itself dramatically. But when Clara sat down with her ledger at the end of August and added the columns, the total was enough to make her still for a moment. She brought the number to Gideon. He looked at it. He looked at it again. That's the full month? Net of materials, yes. That's... Clara, that's more than... He stopped himself, recalibrated. That covers the operating shortfall for the month. I know. And some of next month's, if it holds. It should hold, she said. The settler traffic stays through September. After that it drops off, but I've been thinking about that. What about it? The ranch equipment maintenance carries through winter. That's steady work. And I've had 3 homestead women ask whether I could show them repair techniques. For their own use, not commercially. I told them I could. Gideon frowned. Not with displeasure. It was his thinking frown, which she'd learned to read as distinct from his concerned frown or his tired frown. Teaching? Small things. An afternoon here and there. It builds goodwill. She paused. And it's the right thing to do. They're alone on those homesteads in winter, and if their equipment fails, they can't wait for a settlement season to get it fixed. He was quiet for a moment. You've thought about all of this. I think about it a lot, she said. When I'm working, it's something to think about. Most people think about other things when they're working. I think about problems, Clara said. It's how I'm built. He looked at her with that expression she'd started to recognize, and the one that was trying to be neutral and not quite getting there. That's not a complaint, he said. I know. September brought the last push of the settler season, and Clara's workspace ran at capacity for most of it. She'd taken on Tom Wicker as a genuine assistant by that point. Not just the occasional lesson, but actual work, paid at a rate she'd negotiated with Gideon, which was fair and which Tom received with the specific gratified surprise of someone who hadn't entirely believed the offer until the money materialized. Tom turned out to be not just capable, but fast, which was its own kind of skill, and the combination of his speed and her precision meant they could handle 2 jobs simultaneously when needed. Davy Oaks helped with the heavy lifting and the physical aspects of spreading large canvas pieces. Wagon covers were awkward to work with alone, the kind of thing that required a second set of hands, at least part of the time, and he did it without complaint, which from Davy was as good as enthusiasm. Carl Steffens, in his quiet way, had become a kind of de facto gatekeeper for the business. He was usually the first hand the arriving settlers encountered, and he had a way of giving people the right information without overselling anything. Clara had heard him tell a settler once, in his precise and economical way, "She'll tell you what it needs and what it costs. If she says it can't be fixed, she means it. If she says she can fix it, it'll hold." That was both accurate and, Clara thought, one of the better endorsements she'd received. The word in Borden Creek had shifted, gradually, from curious skepticism to a somewhat grudging acknowledgement that the woman at Hales Crossing was doing legitimate work. This was not universal. Ruth Granger still found the situation faintly unnatural and said so when the topic arose. But the commercial reality was speaking, and commercial reality tends to eventually override social opinion in places where survival is a practical matter. Victor Crow had not said anything more publicly about repair failures. He was watching. Claire could feel it the way you feel weather coming in. Not directly visible yet, but there in the pressure. But one evening in late September, Gideon came to find her at the workspace after the hands had gone in for supper. She was finishing a final stitch on a saddlebag that needed to be done before morning and hadn't stopped to eat yet, which was a thing he'd started to notice and had started to bring her coffee about, without making it into more than it was. He set the coffee beside her and didn't leave. "Something on your mind?" she said. "I looked at the full summer numbers today." She set down the needle. "And?" "We covered the operating deficit," he said. "Not just this month, the whole summer, the cattle revenue plus your work. We're not behind anymore." Clara looked at him. "That's good. That's more than good." He sat down on the upturned crate he'd started using as a seat when he came out to talk to her. "Clara, when my father built this ranch, he believed in it completely. He thought it had a future that was basically guaranteed by what he'd built." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I've been running it since he died, believing in it about half that much, which is not enough to do it justice. This summer is the first time in a long time that I've believed in it the way he did. She looked at him for a long moment. The lantern light was between them, and the night was starting to cool down the way September nights did, the first edge of what was coming in 3 months. It still might get harder before it gets easier, she said. I know that. I'm not trying to... I know, he said. You're being honest. I'd rather have honest. He looked at her. I don't have a lot of people in my life who are honest. You have Cole. Cole's been honest with me for 20 years, and I appreciate it. And it's different. He said it without embarrassment. You know what I mean. Clara was quiet for a moment. She did know what he meant. She also knew that this was the kind of conversation that could go in a direction that needed careful handling, not because she wanted to avoid it, but because she'd learned not to rush things that had a natural pace. Good repairs were the same way. You didn't force the material. You followed it. The curtains, she said. He blinked. What? I'll make them this winter, she said. When the settler work drops off. Proper ones. I've been thinking about what fabric. He looked at her, and there was that expression again. The one she couldn't fully read but had stopped trying to classify and had started simply receiving as whatever it was. All right, he said. Blue, she said. I think blue is right for those windows. He looked at the main house, faintly visible across the dark yard. My wife liked blue. I know. I noticed the remnants on the old curtain rod. He was quiet for a moment. How do you notice things like that? I pay attention to what's been there before me, Clara said. It's not always useful, but it's usually respectful. He looked at her for a long time, and she let him look. And the Wyoming night spread out around them in every direction without any particular interest in what the two of them made of it. Come have supper, he said finally. You haven't eaten. I know. You do this. I get it focused. I know. Come eat. She set down the awl, put a cloth over the unfinished saddlebag, and got up. The workspace had taken on, over the course of the summer, the particular organized density of a place that is in constant productive use. Tools hung precisely, materials sorted by type and weight, the small accumulated evidence of hundreds of hours of work that had left the place humming without turning it chaotic. She looked at it for a second before she followed Gideon in. It was a good workspace. She'd built it from nothing, on a wall that had been bare, in 3 months. She thought she could do more with it. She turned off the lantern and went into supper, and the thought stayed with her through the meal and after, the way practical thoughts do when they've found good ground. Not urgent, just alive, waiting for the right time to grow into something. Outside, the plain was going into the dark, cool and vast and full of the coming season's weather. And somewhere out along the road that ran past Borden Creek, other settlers were moving through with equipment that needed mending, and the word slow and steady was still traveling. It had not yet reached the ears that would make everything harder, but it was getting there. The railroad came in October, which nobody in Borden Creek had quite believed would happen until it did. There had been talk for 2 years, the kind of talk that circulates through small frontier towns, with the particular quality of something that might be true or might be wishful thinking, or might be both at once, depending on the week. A survey crew had come through in the spring of 1882 and walked the land south of town with instruments and notebooks, and then left. And then nothing happened for so long that the talk had mostly faded into the background noise of daily life. Then, in the first week of October 1883, a construction advance crew of 11 men arrived with wagons, equipment, and the specific purposeful energy of people who are being paid by a company with a schedule. They set up camp on the flat ground 2 miles south of Borden Creek, drove stakes, and began clearing the grade. By the second week, the camp had grown to 60 men. By the third week, it was over 120, with supply wagons coming in from Laramie every few days, and a foreman named Douglas Reese, who wore a canvas duster and had the organized manner of a man who had built 6 camps before this one and had learned exactly what went wrong in each of them. Borden Creek's response to all of this was a kind of barely contained excitement mixed with commercial calculation. Victor Crow expanded his store hours immediately and placed a large order from his Cheyenne suppliers within the first week. The hotel hired 2 extra girls for the saloon side. Warren Fitch's wife, Helen, organized a baked goods operation that had her and 3 other women supplying the camp with bread and pies 3 times a week at prices that were firm and fair and immediately accepted. Clara heard about the camp from Sam, who'd been in town when the advance crew arrived, and then went to see it herself 3 days later when she had an errand in Borden Creek. She stood at the edge of the camp road and looked at it for a while. 120 men meant 120 sets of work clothes, sleeping gear, and personal equipment. It meant tents, large canvas construction tents, mess tents, equipment storage tents. It meant wagon covers on the supply wagons, tarps over the material stockpiles, canvas on the grading equipment. It meant all of those things in active daily use in Wyoming autumn weather, which was not gentle. She did the arithmetic on the ride home and arrived at a number that made her sit up straighter on the wagon seat. "You're thinking," Gideon said. He'd come with her that day for no particular reason except that he'd wanted to see the camp himself, and the company was not unwelcome. "I'm always thinking," she said. "You're thinking harder than usual." She told him the number she'd arrived at, not a precise figure, but an estimate of what a camp that size would spend on equipment repair and replacement over the course of a construction season if they were using ordinary Frontier supply channels. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "That's a large number." "It's approximate, but it's in the right range." She watched the road ahead. "I want to talk to their foreman." He turned to look at her. "About a contract. About the possibility of a contract. They'll have repair needs. They're 2 miles from town, which means every time something needs mending, they either have to send a man into Borden Creek and lose a half day at minimum, or they order replacements from Laramie, which costs more and takes longer." She paused. "Or they have someone closer who can handle it." Gideon thought about it. "That's a different scale of work than what you're doing now." "Significantly different. Can you handle it?" She was quiet for a moment, which he'd come to understand was her honest pause. Not the pause of someone who doesn't know the answer, but of someone who won't give a fast answer to a serious question. "I could handle the volume if I had help. Not just Tom. I'd need more people, and I'd need better equipment. A heavier sewing machine for the large canvas work, for one thing. That costs money." "Yes." They drove in silence for a while, the wagon wheels tracking through the dried ruts in the road. "How much would the contract be worth?" Gideon asked. "Enough to matter." "That's not a number." "I don't have a number yet. I'd need to see their equipment inventory, understand what their typical failure rate is, know how long the construction season runs." She shifted on the seat. "I want to talk to Reese first, just to understand what we're dealing with." Gideon nodded slowly. "I'll go with you." "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I want to." They went the following Thursday morning, which was when Clara had calculated Reese would be least likely to be in the middle of a grading decision. She'd made inquiries. Sam had a cousin who'd done railroad construction work and knew the rhythms of a grading camp. And Thursday morning, before the day's main push, was when the foreman typically reviewed supplies and equipment. The camp was louder than it had looked from the road. 120 men doing earthwork created a particular constant noise, iron on earth, shouted instructions, the creak and strain of heavy equipment that was not unpleasant exactly, but was insistent, the way serious work always is. Douglas Reese was where Sam's cousin said he'd be, at the equipment line near the far edge of camp, going over something with a younger man who had the look of a site supervisor. He was 40-something, lean, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of sunburned skin that no longer responds to further sun. He looked at Gideon when they approached, and then at Clara with the particular recalibration of a man who had expected to deal with one thing and found another. "Mr. Reese," Gideon said. "Gideon Hale, Hale's Crossing Ranch. This is Clara Whitmore." Reese shook Gideon's hand and then Clara's. His handshake with her was exactly the same as with Gideon, which Clara noted and appreciated. "What can I do for you?" he said. "I do canvas and leather repair work," Clara said. "Equipment repair. Wagon covers, tents, tarps, harness leather. I'm at Hale's Crossing, 2 miles north." She didn't add qualifications or apologies. "I'd like to understand your repair and replacement situation before I make any kind of proposal." Reese looked at her for a moment. "You do this for the local settlers?" "For the past several months. Before that, 11 years in a commercial repair shop in Dayton." "Ohio?" "Yes." He nodded, and something in his expression shifted from politely skeptical to merely evaluating, which was an improvement. "Walk with me," he said. He took them along the equipment line. Canvas tents, most of them in reasonable condition, but a few showing the early signs of wear that Clara recognized. Stressed seams, slight fraying at stress points, one tent with a diagonal line of slight discoloration that almost certainly indicated a moisture issue in the weave. Wagon covers in variable states. 2 tarps over material stockpiles that had already developed the beginning of perimeter fraying from the wooden stakes pulling at the grommets. Clara kept her mouth shut during the walk. She was there to understand, not to narrate. At the far end, Reese stopped and turned to face them. "What did you see?" he said, directly to Clara. "Your equipment is in reasonable condition overall. The 2 material tarps on the north stockpile are going to lose grommets within the next 3 weeks in any significant wind. The stake angle is pulling on them wrong. That's a fixable problem if it's addressed now, and a replacement problem if it isn't." She indicated the tent with the discoloration. "That tent has a moisture issue in the weave. Not a leak yet, but the waterproofing treatment is breaking down. It needs retreatment before the real cold hits." She paused. "The harness leathers on the 3rd supply wagon from the left have a cracked girth strap that whoever loaded it this morning didn't notice. That one's urgent." Reese was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and walked to the 3rd supply wagon and looked at the girth strap. He looked at it for a while. Then he looked back at Clara. "How did you see that from there?" he said. "I've been looking at harness leather for a long time," she said. He was quiet again. The younger supervisor had appeared at his elbow and was watching the whole exchange with an expression that Clara couldn't entirely read. "What are you proposing?" Reese said. "A service arrangement. I set up at your camp 2-3 days a week. Or you send your damaged equipment to me, whichever is more practical. And I handle the repair work as it comes in. I charge by the job, not a flat fee, because the volume will vary. I'll give you a written estimate before I start any job over a certain amount." She paused. "You stop ordering replacement canvas from Laramie for everything that can be repaired." "Everything that can be repaired," Reese said. "I'll tell you honestly when something can't be. I don't make money off replacement stock. I make money off repair work. It's not in my interest to tell you something is repairable when it isn't." Reese looked at Gideon. "She always this direct?" "Generally, yes," Gideon said. "Good," Reese said. "I've had 3 foremen on this crew who aren't. Cost me 2 months in delays." He looked back at Clara. "Come back Monday with a written rate sheet. If it's reasonable, we'll try it for a month." The rate sheet took Clara 2 evenings to produce. She did it at the kitchen table while Gideon worked on accounts, and she did it carefully. Not cheaply, which would undervalue the work and set a wrong precedent, and not expensively, which would give Reese a reason to decline before the work proved itself. She had a clear sense of what the labor was worth and what the market would bear, and the 2 numbers were close enough that she didn't have to compromise much. She showed it to Gideon when it was done. He read it line by line. "This is fair," he said. "I think so. Reese will negotiate." "He can try," she said. "I've got room to move on the tent treatments, but not on the heavy repair work. The heavy repair work is already priced lean." Gideon looked at her. He'd been watching her work for months now and still occasionally surprised himself with how precisely she understood her own value. Not pridefully, not defensively, just clearly. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need Tom full-time on the camp work if this goes through, and I need to hire someone else." "Who?" "I've been thinking about Dorothea Marsh." He raised an eyebrow. "She's a homesteader. She's a homesteader with good hands and a willingness to work, and a husband who told her no woman could fix a canvas tarp. She's been coming to me for 2 months. She's been watching. She learns fast." Clara set down her pen. "I'd rather train someone I already trust than find a stranger." Gideon absorbed this. "You'd need to pay her." "Of course." "Can the margin support it?" "If the contract with the camp is what I think it can be, yes, comfortably." She paused. "This is the thing, Gideon. This is the thing I've been working toward without quite seeing the shape of it until now. The railroad camp is the reason everything else was preparation." He looked at her for a long moment. "Don't get too far ahead of the contract." "I know. Monday 1st. "Monday 1st, he agreed. Doctor. Reese accepted the rate sheet on Monday with one adjustment, a slightly reduced rate on the tent treatments, which Clara had expected and had already priced with room to give. They shook hands on it. The younger supervisor, whose name turned out to be Will Garrett, recorded the terms in the camp ledger and told Clara, with the efficiency of a man who made things run, that she should report to him each visit for the equipment queue. On the ride back, Clara allowed herself approximately 30 seconds of quiet satisfaction and then started mentally planning the schedule. She spoke to Dorothea Marsh the following day. Dorothea's response to the offer was a silence of about 5 seconds, which Clara had come to recognize as Dorothea's version of enthusiasm, followed by a careful question about pay, followed by acceptance. Her husband's opinion on the matter was not mentioned by either of them. The first week at the railroad camp was difficult in the way that new arrangements are always difficult, not because anything went wrong, but because everything was unfamiliar and had to be learned. The logistics of working at the campsite versus the ranch workspace were different in ways she hadn't entirely anticipated. The scale of the equipment was larger than anything she'd worked on at the ranch, and the working conditions were noisier and less controlled. She adapted. She was good at adapting. By the second week, she had a functional system. Garrett had designated a corner of the large supply tent as her working area when she was on site, and she'd brought enough tools and materials to maintain a mobile kit that covered most situations. The camp hands, after initial curiosity and the inevitable skepticism that Clara had become practiced at outlasting, came to treat her presence as routine. There was one man, a big loud hand named Buster Pell, who had opinions about everything, who made a comment the second day about whether the tent seams were strong enough if a woman sewed them. Clara had turned around and asked him pleasantly whether he'd like to pull test the seam she'd just completed against the factory seam on the adjacent section. He'd shrugged and grabbed both and pulled. The factory seam gave a 1/4 inch of flex. The repair held absolutely. He'd walked away without saying anything else, which was the best possible outcome. Tom worked well in the camp environment. He was faster than Clara in raw output on straightforward repairs, and he'd developed enough technique by now that she could trust him on standard jobs without oversight. What he lacked was judgment, the ability to look at a damaged situation and understand what it needed before picking up a needle. But that was a matter of experience, and it was coming. Dorothea was slower but methodical in a way that Clara valued more than speed on complex jobs. She also had a quality that Clara had noticed in their earlier interactions. She remembered everything she was shown and applied it correctly the first time, without having to be corrected. That was a rare thing. The contract had been running for 3 weeks when Victor Crow came to the ranch. He came on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, in his best coat, driving his own wagon. He was pleasant when Gideon met him at the gate, the surface pleasantness of a man who has decided to have a particular kind of conversation and has composed himself for it. Clara was in the workspace and heard the wagon come in. She stayed where she was. Gideon brought Crow to the workspace because there was no real reason not to, and because Gideon did not particularly believe in having conversations about a person in their absence. "Miss Whitmore," Crow said. His tone was easy and neutral. "I hear you've landed a contract with the railroad camp." "That's right," Clara said. She kept working, not as a dismissal, but because stopping work mid-seam caused problems she'd have to correct later. Quite an accomplishment. He said it in a way that might have meant it or might not. "I came to have a word about supplies, actually." "What about them?" "I understand you've been ordering some of your materials from Cheyenne." He said it without accusation, conversationally. "I wanted to make sure you knew I can match most prices for regular customers, bulk orders especially." "I appreciate that," Clara said. "What I've been ordering isn't something you carry. I could order it. The lead time from your suppliers is longer than the lead time from mine, based on my experience so far." Crow was quiet for a second. He smiled, and the smile was fine, but didn't get all the way to his eyes. "Well, if your arrangement changes, the offer stands." He shifted, looking around the workspace with the particular attention of a man estimating. "You've built quite a little operation here." "I've built an operation," Clara said. He looked at her. She looked at him. Gideon stood slightly to the side with his arms crossed, not saying anything. "The railroad camp," Crow said. "They're good customers for me as well. Or were." He paused. "I imagine Reese will find that some repairs are more complicated than they seem once weather sets in." "I imagine he'll find they're less complicated than replacement," Clara said. Another small pause. "Of course," Crow said. "Well, good afternoon, Miss Whitmore." "Hail." He turned and walked back to his wagon. When he was gone, Gideon turned to look at Clara. "That was a warning," she said, before he could speak. "I know it was." He's going to find a way to undermine the camp contract. He can't actually interfere with the contract. He doesn't have to. He just has to make Reese doubt the work. She set down the needle and looked at the workspace for a moment, thinking. He's not going to confront me directly. That's not how he operates. He'll work around the edges. What do we do? Document everything, Clara said. Every job, every repair, the condition it came in, and the condition it left in. If he creates doubt, I want to be able to answer it with records. She picked up the needle again. And I need to make sure Reese understands what he's getting before Crow has a chance to tell him what he should think about it. The rumors started 10 days later. They arrived in the camp first. Clara heard about them from Will Garrett, who told her without editorial comment that there was talk among the hands that some of the repair work on the supply tarps wasn't up to the sustained wind loads Wyoming would see in November. Where's this coming from? Clara asked. Not sure, Garrett said. He was a careful man, not given to speculation. It's not coming from men who've worked with you. What does Reese think? He hasn't said anything to me about it, but he's heard it. Clara went to find Reese directly. He was at the grading site and she waited until he had a natural break, which took about 20 minutes, and then approached him. She came with her documentation, the repair log she'd been keeping, with dates, descriptions, materials used, and notes on the condition of each repaired piece. You've heard the talk, she said. Reese looked at her steadily. I've heard something. My repair records, she said, and handed him the log. Every job since the contract started. I've noted the condition of each piece when it came in and what I found during the repair. If there's a specific piece you want to inspect, tell me which one and I'll go through it with you. Reese took the log and read it, not quickly. He turned pages. He stopped at certain entries and read them more carefully. Clara waited. Who's spreading this, she said, after he'd had enough time. I don't know, he said, and I'm not going to speculate. I'm not asking you to speculate. I'm asking because if someone is deliberately creating doubt about my work, you should know their motive. Reese looked at her. I know the merchant in town was selling us replacement canvas before you came along, he said. I'm not stupid. I didn't think you were. If the work holds, the talk doesn't matter. He handed the log back. I'm not removing you from the contract over rumors. Thank you, she said, but keep the log if you don't mind. I'll bring updates every week. 3 days later, the storm came. It arrived fast, the way Wyoming storms sometimes do. A front that the sky had been building for a week, but that gave maybe 4 hours of real warning before it hit. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours. The wind picked up from the northwest with serious intent. By midnight, the camp was in the full force of it. Sustained winds that would have tested any canvas structure, with gusts that came in hard and sudden. Clara heard about the tent failure the next morning from Tom, who'd been in Borden Creek when one of the camp hands came through. One of the large mess tents had failed, not torn apart, but collapsed partially when a seam gave, which was enough to dump a significant amount of cold water on 50 men who were trying to eat breakfast and cause general chaos. By the time Clara arrived at the camp, the story had already acquired a shape. She found Garrett first. His expression was careful. Which tent? She said. Number 3 mess. Show me. The tent was down on one side, the collapsed section still wet and heavy. Clara went to where the seam had failed. She could see it clearly, the seam blown out along a 6-foot section. She looked at it for a long time. The seam was not one she had worked on. She knew this because she kept records of exactly what she'd done in each tent, and Mess Tent 3 had received a grommet repair on the east side and a waterproofing treatment on the roof section. The blown seam was on the south wall, which she had not touched. She found the original seam material, factory stitch, which meant it had left the manufacturer with whatever quality the manufacturer had given it. She examined the thread, or what was left of it. It was degraded in a way that went beyond weather stress. The thread had been in poor condition before the storm hit, not worn out over time poor condition, wrong material poor condition. This was not the heavy waxed linen thread appropriate for load-bearing canvas seams. It was something lighter, something that had been used when the tent was assembled or previously repaired by someone other than her. She went to find Reese. He was with 2 other men who Clara didn't know. One of them in a coat too good for a construction site, which suggested he was from the railroad company rather than the camp. Reese's expression when he saw Clara arrive was unreadable. "It wasn't my work," she said directly, before anything else could be said. "I have a record of every piece of that tent I touched. The failed seam is the south wall. I did not touch the south wall of Mess Tent 3. Miss Whitmore," Reese started. "Let me show you." She handed him the record. He looked at it. The man in the good coat was watching with the particular alertness of someone who has a financial stake in what's being decided. "The failed seam used light thread," Clara said. "Not appropriate for a structural canvas seam in this climate. I would never use that material for this application. I can show you the thread I use." "We know what thread you use," Garrett said. He'd appeared at the edge of the group. His voice was flat and informative. "I've been through your supply kit." Clara looked at him. He met her eyes and gave her the small, neutral nod of a man making sure she understood he was being straight with her. "The thread in the failed seam," she said, turning to Reese. "Can I examine it?" Reese looked at the man in the good coat, who appeared to think about it for a moment, and then nodded. Clara went back to the failed seam with Reese and the man from the company, whose name turned out to be Alderman, a supply director, and examined the thread carefully. She held a section of it to the light, ran it between her fingers, compared it to a spool of her own thread. "This isn't standard construction canvas thread," she said. "The weight is wrong. The wax treatment is wrong. Or rather, there isn't one, which is why it degraded in moisture." She paused. "This looks like replacement thread, from a retail source." Alderman looked at the thread. Reese looked at the thread. There was a silence that had a particular quality to it. "Where does the camp get replacement thread for its maintenance supply?" Clara asked. She kept her voice entirely neutral. Another silence. "Crow's in town," Garrett said. He said it the same way he said everything, factually, without color. Clara didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She held the thread and the silence held itself, and Reese and Alderman did the arithmetic in the quiet. "Someone used retail thread on that seam," Alderman said finally. "Recently. The camp has had maintenance hands doing repair work when Miss Whitmore isn't on site," Garrett said. "I can find out which hand did this section." "Do that," Reese said. "I want to be clear about something," Clara said. "I'm not accusing anyone of deliberate sabotage. A camp hand may have used what was available and not understood the difference. That's not malice. That's a training problem." She paused. "But the thread came from somewhere, and if the source of that thread has been telling people in this camp that my repairs are unsafe, while supplying inferior replacement materials for maintenance work, that's a different problem." She could see Reese processing this, carefully, methodically, the way a man processes something he'd rather not have to deal with. "I'll look into where the maintenance materials came from," he said. "That's all I'm asking," Clara said. The investigation, such as it was, on a Frontier construction site, took 2 days. Garrett was thorough and quiet about it, asking questions without making it a production. What he found, and reported to Reese and Clara together, was that a man named Hobson, who did camp maintenance work, had been buying small quantities of repair supplies at Crow's General Store on the camp's account for the past 3 weeks. Hobson was not a malicious man. He was a maintenance hand who'd been told by Crow, when he came in for supplies, that the heavier thread Miss Whitmore used was expensive and probably unnecessary for basic maintenance work. Crow had sold him the lighter thread and a story to go with it. Hobson, when Garrett spoke to him, was genuinely mortified. He'd had no idea the thread grade mattered for structural seams. He'd thought he was being practical. Reese called Victor Crow to the camp on the pretext of a supply discussion, and the conversation that followed was attended by Reese, Alderman from the railroad company, and Garrett as a record keeper. Clara was not present because she had decided that the most powerful version of this outcome was one that didn't require her to be in the room. The evidence would speak for itself. She waited at her workspace at the ranch. Gideon came out after supper. "You haven't eaten again?" "I'm not hungry." He sat down on the crate. "Reese sent word through Sam. He wants you at the camp tomorrow morning." Clara looked up. "Crow's been told the camp account at his store is closed," Gideon said. "Alderman made that decision on behalf of the railroad company." She was quiet for a moment. "You knew that thread wasn't yours," Gideon said, "the moment you heard where the seam had failed." "I knew because I keep records." "You keep records because you saw this coming." "I keep records because it's good practice, she said. And then, after a pause, and because I saw it coming. He looked at her. She looked at her hands, the hands that had been in this work since she was 23 years old, that had learned the difference between materials by feel, that had built a reputation in one summer in a place that had not been inclined to give her one. Crow isn't done, she said. No, Gideon said. He isn't. He's going to find another way, probably. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. But he didn't win this one, Clara. You beat him at his own game, and he knows it, and now Reese knows it, and that man Alderman from the railroad company knows it. That's not nothing. No, she said. It isn't. She picked up the awl and went back to the harness piece on the table, and Gideon stayed, and the lantern burned between them in the dark of the October night. The camp contract was intact. The work continued. But something in the quality of the quiet had changed. The particular edge that comes into a situation when the easy phase is over and what's coming next is harder, and both people in the room know it even if neither one of them says it aloud. Clara Whitmore kept her hands moving. That was what she did when things got difficult. It was the only way she knew to keep moving forward. Crow came with a lawyer. That was the first sign that this was not going to be a conversation. Conversations arrived on horseback or by wagon, one man, hat in hand or not, depending on his manners. What arrived at Hale's Crossing on the second Monday of November was Crow in his good coat and a man named Aldous Fitch, no relation to Warren, who carried a leather document case and had the careful, slightly distant expression of a professional who has separated himself from the moral dimension of his work. Gideon was at the fence line when Sam came to get him, and he walked back to the yard with the particular measured pace of a man who wants to know what he's walking into before he gets there. Clara was in the workspace. She'd seen the wagon come in and stayed where she was, finishing the grommet she was setting, because stopping mid-work for Victor Crow was not something she was willing to do anymore. Crow greeted Gideon with the specific warmth of a man who has very bad news to deliver and wants to soften the room first. Gideon did not offer coffee. He stood in the yard with his arms at his sides and waited. "I'm sorry to come out on a Monday," Crow said. "This is Aldous Fitch. He handles some of my legal matters." Fitch opened the document case and produced a paper, which he handed to Gideon with the efficiency of someone who has handed people bad news in paper form many times. Gideon read it. His face did not change. He read it again. "What is this?" he said. "Your father took a loan in 1871, Crow said, "against the property. I acquired the note from the original lender, a man named Garrett Howell, in 1879. It's been sitting, accruing interest, because your father's estate passed to you without formal settlement of the debt." He paused. "I should have pressed this earlier. I didn't, out of respect for Dutch Hale." "Dutch Hale has been dead for 4 years, Gideon said. "I know, and I'm sorry to bring this now. But the circumstances have changed." Crow's tone remained even. "The note is due. The full amount, with accrued interest, comes to $840. The number landed in the yard like something dropped from a height. Clara had come to the edge of the workspace. She was standing there with an awl in her hand, having heard the number through the cold morning air. She looked at Gideon's back. She could read nothing from it. He was very still, which with Gideon was never a good sign. "And when is it due?" Gideon said. 60 days, Fitch said. He had the voice of a man who rarely spoke first but was precise when he did. 60 days from today, per the terms of the original note as modified by acquisition. 60 days is January, Gideon said. "Yes," Crow said. "I know the timing is difficult." "You came after the cattle sales season," Gideon said. His voice was flat. Crow didn't answer that. "You waited until the railroad camp closed for winter." "Gideon, you know exactly what you did," Gideon said. The flatness in his voice had a particular quality to it. Not anger, exactly, because anger would have been louder. It was the controlled voice of a man understanding the full scope of a situation and making sure the other person knew that he understood it. "You've been sitting on this note since 1879, and you're calling it now because you think I can't raise $800 in January." Crow met his eyes. "The debt is legitimate, Gideon. Whatever the timing, Dutch Hale borrowed that money." "I'm sure he did, and I'm sure you acquired the note for a reason." Gideon looked at him for a long moment. "What do you want? The ranch?" I want what I'm owed, Crow said. If the debt isn't paid, the property secures it. That's the note. Fitch had put the document back in the case with the efficiency of someone whose job was done. He stood slightly apart, looking at the fence line. I'll look at the note, Gideon said. Of course. Crow's manner remained pleasant, which was the most infuriating thing about him. I'm not looking for a fight, Hale. If there's a way to work this out, I'm open to discussing it. Get off my property, Gideon said. Crow nodded once, without apparent offense, and got back in his wagon. Clara did not say anything until the wagon was gone past the road bend. Then she walked to where Gideon was standing and stood next to him and looked at the road. How much of that did you know about? She asked. None of it. His voice was still careful. My father had debts. Most of them were settled when he died. I went through everything with a land lawyer in Laramie. I don't know how this got missed, or whether Crow hid it until now. Can he do this legally? I'd need to see the original note. Fitch is competent enough that the paperwork will be in order. He turned to look at her. $840, Clara. She didn't flinch at the number, even though it was enormous. How much do you have accessible right now? Cattle revenue from the fall sale is about $200. He said it without softening it. The operating costs have been covered, the deficit is gone, but reserve cash, he shook his head. Not $800. She was quiet. The cold November air moved across the yard, and the grass was brown and flat under it, and the sky was the specific gray that meant real winter coming. I need to think, she said. Clara, not about whether it's solvable, about how. She turned to look at him directly. Give me until tonight. He looked at her. He was trying to keep the thing off his face that came into men's faces when they'd been hit hard. Not pride exactly, but the particular expression of someone who doesn't want to be seen in a moment like this. She understood it because she'd had her own version of it, and she understood that the right thing to do was not to comment on it. Tonight, he said. Meh. She spent the day working, which was how she thought best. Her hands on familiar material, the repetition of a task she could do without conscious direction, left her mind free to run through the problem systematically. $840 in 60 days. The railroad camp had closed for winter the previous week. The construction season ran through October and resumed in April when the ground thawed, and in the interim the 120 men dispersed to winter quarters in Laramie and Cheyenne. The camp contract was intact. Reese had confirmed it for the spring season before he left, and had paid the November invoice in full, but there was no revenue coming from it until April. The settler season was over. The settler traffic that had sustained the summer months dried up in late September and would not return until May at the earliest. What she had was the ranch's internal maintenance work, which was steady but small. And she had Dorothea and Tom, who were skilled now but whose skills were only generating income if there was work to apply them to. She turned it over. The problem with the winter was not that there was no work. The problem was that the work was in the wrong places. The railroad camp was closed, but the railroad company's equipment didn't disappear for winter. It sat in storage yards in Laramie and Cheyenne, and it would come out in the spring in the same condition it went in, or worse, if it sat improperly through freeze and thaw cycles. Equipment that went into spring storage properly maintained and waterproofed lasted longer and needed less repair in the working season. Equipment that sat without treatment came out in April, needing significant work before it could be used. She thought about this in October, but not with any urgency, because in October there had been no urgency. Now there was urgency. She set down the canvas section at 4 o'clock and went to find Tom. He was in the barn working on a broken wagon hitch with Davy. She pulled him aside. The railroad equipment, she said. When Reese packed out, where did the camp equipment go? Laramie, mostly, Tom said. Some to Cheyenne. They've got storage yards. Who manages the storage yards? Some company man. I don't know who. He looked at her. Why? Because that equipment needs winter maintenance work before spring. Treatment, repair, proper storage preparation. And nobody's being paid to do it right now because nobody's thought to offer. She looked at him steadily. If I could get a contract for winter storage maintenance on the railroad's equipment, we'd have income through January and February. Tom processed this. That's a different client than Reese. Reese was the camp foreman. The equipment belongs to the railroad company. I'd need to go to the company directly. She paused. I need Alderman's information. the supply director who was at the camp. Garrett might know, Tom said. Find out if Garrett's still in Laramie. Book. She talked to Gideon that evening as promised. She laid out what she was thinking, not as a finished plan because it wasn't finished, but as a framework that she needed him to understand before she spent energy on it. He listened without interrupting. That was a thing she'd come to value about him. He could listen to a thing all the way through without inserting himself into it, which was rarer than it should have been. When she was done, he said, "The winter storage contract. You don't have it." "Not yet." "And the $800 is due in 60 days. "I know." "If you can't get the storage contract, then we sell cattle," she said, "at winter prices, which are bad. Or we find a bank loan, which will take time we may not have." She looked at him. "I'd rather try for the storage contract first. You'd have to hire more people for the volume of equipment they have in those yards." "Yes." "Who?" This was the part she'd been working through most carefully. "There are women in this valley who have been coming to me for lessons. 6 of them, maybe 8, who have genuine aptitude. They're homesteader wives. They need income and they have the time in winter because winter on a small homestead is not a busy season." Gideon was quiet. "I know it sounds like a lot of moving pieces," Clara said. "It sounds like you're trying to build a business in 60 days. "I'm trying to pay a debt in 60 days, she said. "The business is how I do that." He looked at her for a long time. The fire in the hearth moved behind him, and the kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee, and the particular smell of canvas that had become part of this house in the months since her arrival, embedded in the air the way things become embedded when they belong somewhere. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need you to trust me." She said it simply. "And I need the barn's main floor cleared for workspace. The cattle are in the south pasture. The barn's not in use for anything critical." "Then I need the barn." He looked at her. "You have it," he said. No. She wrote to Alderman that night. Sam rode to Laramie the next morning with the letter. While she waited for a response, she did not wait passively. She rode out to the homestead she knew. Dorothea Marsh first, then a woman named Agnes Hollis, whose husband had a small grain operation, then 3 others whose names she'd accumulated over the months of teaching visits. She explained what she was proposing: paid work, specific tasks, training provided, work based out of Hales Crossing starting as soon as she could confirm the contract. None of them said no. 2 of them wanted to talk to their husbands first, which Clara accepted as a reasonable condition, and both came back within 2 days with confirmation. Dorothea Marsh did not consult her husband, which Clara noted without comment. The barn transformation took 3 days. Gideon and the hands moved what needed moving, built 2 additional work tables from lumber in the storage shed, ran a second lantern line from the existing barn wiring so the space had enough light for fine work. Cole Dearborn, who had been watching all of this with his customary unreadable expression, helped without being asked and said nothing except, on the second day of construction, "Your father would have liked this, Gideon," which Gideon received without responding to verbally, though something in his face shifted. Alderman's response came 6 days after the letter was sent. Clara opened it at the kitchen table with Gideon sitting across from her. He was watching her read it, and she was aware of his watching and understood why. She read it twice. Then she set it down. "He's interested," she said. "He wants to meet." Gideon exhaled, the small, controlled exhale of a man who had been holding something without admitting he was holding it. "When?" "He can be in Laramie next Tuesday. He wants me to come to the storage yard so I can see the equipment volume." She looked at Gideon. "I need to go to Laramie. I'll take you." "You don't—" "I'll take you," he said again. It wasn't an argument. It was a statement. She looked at him for a moment. "All right." Laramie in November was cold and gray and smelled like coal smoke and horse. They arrived Tuesday morning and met Alderman at the railroad storage yard on the south side of town, which was a large, flat, fenced area with rows of equipment in various states of organization: wagon frames, canvas stockpiles, crate goods, machinery components covered with tarps. Alderman was businesslike and direct, which Clara had already formed as her opinion of him from the camp episode. He took them through the yard himself. The scope of it was larger than she'd estimated. There was enough canvas equipment alone to occupy 3 full-time workers for 6 weeks. Combined with the leather harness goods and the tarp materials, it was a substantial job. She did not let the size of it show on her face. "What's your current maintenance arrangement for winter storage?" she asked. "We don't have one," Alderman said, with the bluntness of a man who doesn't enjoy admitting it. "The crew packs out, the equipment sits. We've had deterioration problems in past seasons. A significant percentage of the canvas goods need repair at the start of each season that wouldn't have been needed if they'd been stored properly." "What does that cost you in spring delays?" He named a figure that made Clara's expression stay very, very still. "I can put this yard in order," she said. "Proper inspection, treatment, repair of anything that needs it before storage, correct covering and organization. I'd need to bring workers. I have trained workers available. The cost would be—" She calculated for 2 seconds. "The cost would be considerably less than what you're currently losing in spring repair and delay time." Alderman looked at her, he looked at Gideon, he looked at the yard. "How long?" he said. "For this volume, with my team, 6 weeks. Maybe 5 if the damage rate is lower than I'm estimating." "That gets you to mid-January." "Yes." He named a figure. It was not what she'd hoped for, but it was workable. She counter-named a figure. He paused, looked at the yard, and came back with a number between the two. She accepted it because it was fair, and because she understood that fair was more sustainable than winning. They shook hands in the cold Laramie air, and Alderman said he'd have the paperwork to her by Friday, and Clara said she'd have her team ready to start the following Monday. On the ride back to Borden Creek, she ran the numbers in her head 3 times to make sure she wasn't making an error in the arithmetic. She wasn't. The Laramie contract, combined with what was already in the operating account, would get them to within about $200 of the total debt. Close. Not there. Gideon drove and didn't push her to talk. He'd learned to read when she was calculating and leave her to it. After maybe 20 minutes, she said, "We're going to be short." "How short?" 200, roughly. Unless the repair damage rate in the yard is higher than average, then the job value goes up and we might be fine. But I can't count on that. "I have cattle I can sell," he said. "Winter prices." "I know, but if it fills the gap." He kept his eyes on the road. "I won't sell more than I have to." She was quiet for a moment. "There's another option." "What?" "The camp contract for spring is confirmed. I could ask Reese for an advance on the first month's invoice." She paused. "It's not ideal. It puts me in a position of asking." "Is that a problem?" "It's a thing I prefer not to do," she said honestly. "I'd rather earn forward than borrow backward." "That's a principle," he said. "But $200 in 60 days is a practical problem." "I know." They drove. "I'll write to Reese," she said finally, "and you hold the cattle as a backup." She looked at him. "I don't want to sell your cattle, Gideon." "There are cattle," he said. The 2 words dropped into the wagon's quiet and sat there, and Clara looked at the road and didn't respond immediately, and Gideon didn't elaborate, and the wagon moved through the cold gray afternoon with both of them carrying what had just been said without needing to examine it directly. The work in Laramie started the following Monday. Clara took Tom, Dorothea, and 4 of the homestead women, Agnes Hollis, a woman named Frances Briggs, who turned out to be extraordinarily fast with a needle, a younger woman named Nell Carver, who was 17 and learning faster than anyone Clara had trained before, and a quiet Swedish woman named Ingrid Sola, who didn't say much but worked with a concentration that Clara recognized as kinship. They boarded together at a respectable rooming house near the storage yard for the week, working days and returning to Borden Creek on weekends. Clara had negotiated the rooming house cost into the contract overhead, which Alderman had accepted without debate. The first day in the yard confirmed her estimate. The deterioration rate was average, not worse than expected, not better. They would need all 6 weeks and the job would come in close to her projected value, which meant the shortfall would still exist when they were done. She wrote to Reese on the Wednesday of the first week. She kept the letter professional and specific. She explained the situation without over-explaining it. She asked for a $200 advance on the spring contract's first invoice, against the work already confirmed. She sent it by the Tuesday post and received a response 11 days later. Reese had written back in his characteristic style, which was direct and short. He said the advance was a reasonable request given the confirmed contract and the work already performed in the fall season. He said to expect the draft by the end of November. Clara read the letter in the storage yard with canvas dust on her hands, and Frances Briggs working 5 feet away on a tarpaulin. She read it twice, folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and went back to work. Frances said without looking up. Good news? Workable news, Clara said, which was what she said about most things. The nights in Laramie were long and quiet in the rooming house. The women talked at supper in a way that women talk when they're away from their regular lives, and the usual social rules have loosened somewhat. Agnes Hollis was funny in a dry way that Clara hadn't discovered in the homestead visits. Nell Carver, for all her 17 years, had opinions about everything and stated them with a confidence that Clara found genuinely refreshing. Ingrid Sola, when she finally spoke at length, on the fourth evening, over a discussion of whether a certain tent corner repair could be done with a different grommet size, turned out to have strong technical opinions that she expressed precisely and without social apology, which made Clara like her enormously. Dorothea Marsh said on the fifth evening, "My husband still doesn't believe this is real." "The job?" Clara said. "The money." Dorothea wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I brought home what I earned the first week." He looked at it like it might be wrong, like someone had made an error. Clara looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said I'd be bringing the same amount every week until January." Dorothea's expression was impossible to classify. It was not triumphant and not sad and not simple. He didn't say anything else about it. The table was quiet for a moment. "My father said I couldn't do this work," Clara said. It came out without particular planning. Not the specific work. Any work outside the house. He thought it was wrong for a woman to have a skill that took her out into the world. She looked at her coffee. He wasn't a bad man. He just had a fixed picture of what was appropriate. "What happened?" Agnes asked. "He died when I was 22. I got a job at the canvas shop 3 weeks later because I needed to eat." She paused. "I wasn't making a statement. I was surviving, but it turned out to be the same thing." Nell Carver was looking at her with the specific intensity of a 17-year-old absorbing something she intends to keep. Clara noticed it and didn't remark on it, but filed it away. The work in Laramie ran into its fourth week when Crow made his next move. It came through the town, the way things traveled in small places. An incremental pressure, a series of conversations that seemed separate but weren't. Clara heard about it from Gideon, who rode to Laramie on the weekend of the fourth week with a specific expression that told her he had something to tell her that he hadn't wanted to write in a letter. They walked in the storage yard after the other women had gone to supper. "Crow's been talking about the debt," Gideon said. "In town, specifically about the 60-day deadline." Clara looked at him. "What's he saying?" "That the ranch can't possibly raise $840 by January, that once the property transfers." Gideon's jaw was set. "He's already talking about it as a transaction that's completed." "He's trying to make it feel inevitable," Clara said. "He's doing a good job of it. I had 2 men come to me separately last week with the kind of sympathetic faces people get when they've already decided something is over." "What did you tell them?" "That the debt would be paid." He looked at her. "I didn't tell them how because I'm not sure I fully believe how yet, and I didn't want to say something I couldn't back up." Clara turned this over. The money picture was this. The Laramie job would complete around mid-January, delivering a net amount after wages that would cover most of the gap. Reese's advance was confirmed. Between those two things and the operating cash, they would be at approximately $800 when the final accounting came in. $40 short of the note. She had not told Gideon about the $40 shortfall yet because she had been intending to solve it before she had to. She told him now, standing in the cold storage yard with equipment stacked in rows around them. He listened. Then, $40. "I'll find it." "I have $40, Clara." "I know you do. That's not—" She stopped, looked at him. "That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that $40 is solvable. $840 looked insurmountable 6 weeks ago." He looked at her for a moment. "You've been carrying all of this." "We've been carrying all of this," she said. "You cleared the barn. You drove to Laramie. You're managing the ranch through winter short-handed because Tom and I are here half the week. That's not the same as what you're doing. It's the same in the ways that matter." She turned to face him directly. "Gideon, we're going to pay this debt. Crow is telling people it's over because he wants it to feel over. It isn't." He looked at her in the fading afternoon light, and she could see him doing the thing he sometimes did, recalibrating, adjusting the picture he'd been carrying. He'd carried a picture of this ranch as something he was keeping alive out of obligation for a long time. She'd been watching that picture change all year, and it still moved her when she saw it happening. $40, he said again. $40. I'll have it when you need it. I know, she said. I've always known.
It does, but...
The last 2 weeks of the Laramie work were the hardest because they were the most physically demanding. The large wagon frames and heavy tarp materials that had been deferred to the end of the job because they required the most labor. Clara's hands ached by the end of each day, in a way she didn't mention because mentioning it wouldn't help. Frances Briggs had developed a blister on her right palm that Clara had treated and wrapped, and which Frances had declined to complain about with a stoicism that Clara respected. Nell Carver had stopped being nervous around the heavy equipment and had started being efficient around it, which was the transition point Clara had been waiting for with her. Dorothea Marsh, on the second-to-last day, said quietly while they were working side by side on a large equipment tarpaulin, "I want to keep doing this." Clara looked at her. After the winter job, in the spring, with the camp work. She kept her hands moving, the needle going through the canvas with the steady rhythm she'd developed over weeks. "I know I'd need to work out the arrangements at home, but I want to keep doing this work." "Good," Clara said. "I want you to." "My husband's opinion has changed somewhat," Dorothea said. The understatement was dry enough to be deliberate. "Money changes opinions." "It does," Clara agreed. On the final day, Alderman came to inspect the completed work. He walked the entire yard with Clara, checking the organized inventory, the treated and repaired canvas sections, the prepared equipment. He was thorough and specific and found 2 minor items he wanted addressed, which Clara's team fixed in the time it took him to complete his walk. He signed the completion paperwork, shook Clara's hand, and said, "This is better than I expected." She said, "I told you it would be." He seemed slightly surprised by this, then appeared to decide he appreciated it. "I'll be in contact with you before the spring season," he said. "There's additional storage in Cheyenne we may want serviced." She noted this without letting what it meant show on her face, because the immediate problem was still immediate, and there was no use getting ahead of it. The final payment came through 3 days later, which was the 11th of January. Clara sat at the kitchen table of Hale's Crossing, the same table where she'd spread her tools on her first evening, where she'd shown Gideon the repair ledger, where they'd had 100 conversations that had built the specific architecture of what they were to each other, and added the numbers one final time. The railroad advance from Reese, the Laramie contract final payment, the operating cash. She wrote the total at the bottom of the column. She looked at it for a long time. She called Gideon in from the other room. He came and looked at the number she was pointing to. "That's $812, he said. "Yes." He went to the mantelpiece, the same mantelpiece that still held the old clock that didn't run, and a photograph of Dutch Hale that she'd always been respectful of, and came back with a small tin. He opened it and counted out $28 in coin and 2 bills and set it next to her ledger. "That's 40, he said. "I know what it is," she said. "Then we have $852, he said, "which is 12 more than we need." She looked at the money on the table, then at him. He was watching her with an expression that was tired and solid and something else she didn't try to name. "Crow comes on Friday," he said. "I know." "Will you be here?" She looked at him. "Where else would I be?" He didn't smile. He wasn't a man who smiled easily or often. But something in his face that had been set and tense for 6 weeks released. Not dramatically, but in the way of a thing that has been under pressure for a long time and finally is not. Outside, the Wyoming January pressed cold and flat against the windows, and the barn that had been cleared and converted stood in the dark yard full of organized tools and proper workspace. And somewhere down the road in Borden Creek, Victor Crow thought he was coming on Friday to collect a property. He was coming to collect a debt. That was a different thing entirely. And Clara Whitmore, who had arrived in this town with a canvas roll of tools and no particular welcome, and had built something real from what others had written off, sat at the kitchen table and looked at the money and let herself feel, for exactly as long as it was practical to feel it, exactly what she had done. Then she picked up her needle and went back to work. There was still Friday to get through. Friday came in cold and clear, the way Wyoming January mornings sometimes do. The sky a hard, pale blue, and the ground frozen solid underfoot, the kind of day that has no sympathy in it and makes no promises about warming up later. Clara was awake before dawn. She wasn't anxious, exactly. It was more the quality of alertness that comes before something that matters. The same feeling she'd had on the morning of the Laramie inspection, on the morning she first went to meet Reese, on the morning she'd arrived at Hale's Crossing with a canvas roll under her arm and found a man holding his hat in front of a crumbling ranch and not knowing what to do with either of them. A kind of charged stillness. Not fear, just recognition that the day was significant, and her body knew it before her mind had fully engaged. She made coffee. She built up the fire. She sat at the kitchen table with the money, counted and organized, the paper bills pressed flat, the coins in a cloth, the total documented in the ledger in her own handwriting, and drank her coffee and looked at it. $852. Gideon came downstairs while it was still dark, which was normal for him, and stopped when he saw her sitting there. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Me neither." He poured coffee, sat across from her, looked at the money. "It's real," he said. Not to her specifically, to himself maybe, or just to the room. "It's real," she confirmed. They sat in the early morning quiet. Outside, the dark was starting to thin at the edges. In the barn, one of the horses moved and the sound carried in the cold air. The kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the faint mineral smell of winter coming through the window gaps. "I want to say something," Gideon said. Clara looked at him. "I know this was your work," he said. "I know what you built this year, and I know what it cost you, and I'm not going to pretend it was equal between us or that what I did was the same as what you did." He turned the coffee cup in his hands, the way he did when he was working out the exact shape of something. "My father built this ranch. I kept it. I didn't know the difference until you got here." "Gideon, let me finish." He looked at her directly. "You didn't save this ranch because you had to. You didn't do it because you owed me anything. You came here with a letter and a bag of tools, and you looked at everything that was broken, and you got to work." He paused. "I don't know how to repay something like that." Clara was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled in the hearth. "You don't repay it," she said. "That's not what it was." She looked at him across the table. "I built something here because it was worth building, because the land is good, like I said on the first day, because the people are worth working alongside." She paused. "Because you didn't stand in my way, which is more than most men have done." He looked at her. The first light was coming through the east window now, pale and thin. "The curtains," she said. He blinked. "What?" "I made them. Last week, before we came back from Laramie." She tilted her head toward the window. "I put them up yesterday while you were at the fence." He turned and looked at the window. The curtains were blue, the particular shade she'd decided on in October, a medium blue that was neither cheerful nor somber, but solid and real. They were not elaborate. They were well made, with reinforced hems and properly weighted edges so they hung straight. He looked at them for a long time. "Blue," he said. "Blue," she said. He turned back to her. His expression had several things in it that he didn't try to order or compose, and she held his gaze and didn't look away. And between them the morning came fully through the window in a light that was cold and clear and had no sentimentality in it whatsoever, which was exactly right. Crow arrived at 10 in the morning with Fitch and a third man Clara didn't recognize, a heavy-set fellow with a land assessor's bag, which told her everything about what Crow had expected this morning to be. The hands had all found reasons to be near the yard. Sam was checking fence posts directly adjacent to the house. Davy was examining the water trough with unnecessary concentration. Carl Steffens was standing near the barn with his arms crossed, not pretending to be doing anything. Tom Wicker was at the edge of the workspace with a piece of canvas he was supposed to be cutting but wasn't cutting. Cole Dearborn stood on the porch with Gideon, which was where Cole stood when something important was happening. Clara came out of the house when the wagon came through the gate. She had the ledger under her arm and the cloth of money in her hand, and she walked to the yard without hurrying. Crow climbed down. He looked at the yard, at the hands positioned around it, at the barn workspace visible through the open door, at the general solidity of things that had been in worse repair when he'd last visited. He looked at Clara. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite surprise, but was the adjustment a man makes when a scene doesn't match the version he'd been carrying. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Hale." He nodded to both of them. "I'm here for the settlement of the note."
I know, Clara said. She handed him the cloth.
$840.
Count it.
Crow took the cloth. He didn't open it immediately. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the pleasant surface ease he usually wore, and not the mild implied threat of the November visit. Something flatter. Something recalculating. Fitch stepped forward and took the cloth from Crow, opened it, and began to count. He was precise and efficient about it, which Clara appreciated even under the circumstances. He stacked the bills, counted the coin, ran the total twice. $852, Fitch said. "The note calls for $840, Clara said. "The 12 over is for accrued interest through today's date. I calculated it from the note terms. If your calculation differs, I have the workings in the ledger." Fitch looked at his own documents. He checked something, looked up. "The calculation is accurate." Crow still hadn't said anything. He was looking at the money in Fitch's hands with the expression of a man watching a plan dissolve, not loudly, but completely. "The note," Clara said. Fitch looked at Crow. Crow, after a moment, nodded once. Fitch produced the note from his case and handed it across. Gideon took it and looked at it. Looked at it the way you look at something that has been weighing on you for months, not reading it exactly, but confirming that it exists and that it is now in your hand and not someone else's. "Mark it satisfied," Clara said to Fitch. Fitch produced a pen, made the notation on his copy, dated it, and handed the receipt to Gideon. The assessor with the land bag had not moved from the wagon. He was looking at the scene with the expression of a man who had been brought to do a job and now clearly wasn't going to do it and was uncertain whether to stay or leave. Crow turned to look at him. "You can go, Hennessy," he said. Hennessy climbed back up on the wagon. For a moment the yard was very quiet. The cold air moved through it. Carl was still standing by the barn. Sam had stopped pretending to examine the fence post. Tom had set down the canvas entirely. Crow looked at Clara. There was no pleasantness in his face now, and no threat either. It was just the look of a man who has run a long game and had it end badly, and knows it. "You're more resourceful than I expected," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment, and it wasn't quite a concession. It was just a fact, stated with the particular flatness of someone who is done arguing. "Most people are," Clara said, "when they have something worth working for." Crow held her gaze for a moment, then turned and climbed back into his wagon without anything else. Fitch got up beside him. The wagon turned and went back through the gate and down the road, and Hennessy followed in the assessor's wagon, and they watched until both wagons had cleared the bend and disappeared behind the cottonwoods. No one spoke for a second. Then Cole said, from the porch, "Well," and Tom let out a breath that was half a laugh, and Davy actually smiled, which was rare enough to be notable, and Carl Steffens turned back to the barn with the satisfied expression of a man who saw this coming and is glad to have been right. Gideon looked at the receipt in his hand, then at Clara. She looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, and the morning held everything that needed to be held in that particular silence. The Valley's accounting of what had happened took the better part of the following weeks to fully circulate, and when it did, it was not a dramatic story the way Crow might have told it if the outcome had been different. There was no single moment of public revelation. There was no confrontation in the town square. There was instead the slow, practical revision that happens in places where people know each other's business, a gradual shift in how the facts were understood and who was given credit for them. Crow's store remained open. He was a businessman and a resilient one, and the loss of the railroad account and whatever plans he'd had for the Hales Crossing property had not ruined him. He was diminished, though. The particular authority that had come from being the one person in Borden Creek who knew things others didn't, who held notes on properties and extended or withheld credit with the ease of long practice. That was not what it had been. People remembered the tent seam. They remembered the inferior thread sold to the railroad hand. Some things, once noticed, don't go back to being invisible. Ruth Granger, who had told Clara she must miss proper women's work, brought in a torn dress to the workspace in February and did not mention the irony or acknowledge the previous conversation. Claire repaired the dress without comment. Ruth paid. She left and came back 2 weeks later with a tablecloth that needed its border resewn, and this time she stayed to watch and asked one technical question, and Clara answered it. And that was the beginning of whatever they would eventually be to each other, which was not friendship exactly, but was the honest, functional respect of two women in a small place who had revised their opinions. Dorothea Marsh's husband came to the ranch in late February with a tent that needed serious work and the specific manner of a man who wanted to say something and was organizing his courage around it. He shook Clara's hand when he paid and said, with difficulty, "Dorothea is a better worker than I knew." It was the most he could manage, and Clara understood it for what it was. Nell Carver came back in March, this time asking if she could apprentice more formally in the spring season. Clara said yes without hesitation and wrote to Nell's mother explaining the arrangement, and Nell's mother wrote back a letter that was 3 pages long and thanked Clara in terms that were somewhat overwhelming, which Clara read once and then folded away. The spring contract with the railroad camp opened in April, larger than the previous season because Alderman had made good on his mention of the Cheyenne storage yard. Clara negotiated the expanded terms with Reese and Alderman together, in a meeting where she was the only woman in the room, and this fact was the least interesting thing about the meeting to anyone present, including her. She hired Frances Briggs permanently. She hired Ingrid Sola for the camp season. She kept Tom Wicker on, though she had started nudging him towards something more. He had enough skill now to train others, which was a multiplying capability, and she told him so. And he received it with the particular look of someone being handed a responsibility they didn't expect and are not sure they deserve, which was exactly the right response. The ranch itself, Hale's Crossing, Dutch. Hale's original construction, the thing that Gideon had been keeping alive out of obligation for years, became something different gradually, the way most real things change. The cattle operation continued. Gideon was a rancher, and he had always been a rancher, and that didn't change. But the financial architecture of the place changed entirely. The repair business was no longer a supplemental income propping up the cattle revenue. It was a parallel operation, robust enough to stand independent of the seasonal cattle cycles, which had always been the vulnerability. A bad cattle year no longer meant a crisis. It meant adjusting and continuing. The bunkhouse got a proper floor. The barn roof that had been the worst of the original repairs got replaced. Not just patched, actually replaced, with Gideon and the hands doing most of the labor and Clara working alongside them on the sections that required it. The main house got its porch railing fixed, which had been loose for 3 years, and the kitchen got a proper range to replace the aging one that had been held together with maintenance and stubbornness. None of it happened all at once. None of it was perfect. The new barn roof had a section that needed adjustment after the first winter tested it, and Gideon fixed it himself with the particular resigned competence of a man who has been fixing things on this land his entire adult life and expects to keep doing so. The kitchen range was secondhand from a Laramie hardware dealer and had a temperament that required understanding before it cooperated. The bunkhouse floor was level everywhere except the northwest corner, which had a subtle grade that 2 of the hands used as an excuse for why their card game outcomes were wrong, which was not a compelling argument, but was an entertaining one. This was what the Frontier actually looked like when it worked. Not resolved, not finished. Just incrementally better, season by season, through the accumulated effort of people who had decided the place was worth the effort. On an evening in late April, when the ground had thawed and the first settlers of the new season had appeared on the road, and the railroad camp to the south was active again, and the workspace in the barn was running at capacity, and the curtains in the kitchen were still blue and still hung straight, Gideon found Clara at the workspace after supper. She was doing something that required close attention, and very little looked up when he came in. "Reese wants to know if we can service 3 additional wagons this season," he said. He sent a letter. "We can. Tell him yes." He leaned against the doorframe. She kept working. This was their normal. Him in the doorframe, her at the bench, the lantern between them, the Wyoming evening outside making its own sounds. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me." "I want to change the name." She looked up. "The ranch. It's been Hale's Crossing since my father named it, and it should stay Hale because it's Hale land, and I'm not interested in erasing that." He looked at the workspace, the tools on their hooks, the organized materials, the evidence of 2 years' deliberate work. "But I want to add to it." "Add what?" "Whitmore," he said. It landed simply, without ceremony, which was the right way for it to land between them. Hale and Whitmore. Clara was quiet. She looked at him. "That's a business name," she said carefully. "It's a business name," he agreed, "and whatever else you want it to be." She held his gaze. The lantern light moved between them, and the April air came through the barn door carrying the smell of thawed earth and new grass, and the distant sounds of a working camp 2 miles south. "That would require a conversation," she said. "I know, I'm starting it." She looked at him for a long moment. Gideon Hale, who had written a letter asking for someone to hem his curtains and gotten a woman with a canvas roll full of tools, and the specific, implacable quality of someone who looked at broken things and got to work. Who had watched her work for 2 years without standing in front of her, which was, she had come to understand, the best thing anyone had ever done for her, and not a small thing, and not something she would ever take lightly. "All right," she said. He didn't move from the doorframe. She didn't move from the bench. But something had shifted, small and solid and real, in the space between them. "The Sorens are coming through next week," she said after a moment. "I had a letter from Martha Soren. The wagon cover is holding, but one of their harness straps finally gave. I'll have Sam clear them space in the north yard." "Good." She picked up the needle again. "And the apple tree by the east pasture fence. It's flowering." He looked at her. "So I might make that pie," she said. "Eventually, when there's time." He said, "There's no rush," which was what he'd said about the curtains in the first week, and she remembered it, and he knew she remembered it, and that was enough. Said, "What this place taught, if a place can teach anything, is not that hard work guarantees outcomes. It doesn't. The frontier had swallowed harder workers than either of them and would go on doing so indifferently without apology. What it taught was narrower and more specific, and probably more useful, that the way you look at broken things determines what's possible. Crow looked at the broken ranch and saw a property to be acquired. The town looked at Clara Whitmore and saw a woman in the wrong kind of work. Gideon himself, for years, had looked at Hale's Crossing and seen something he was obligated to maintain rather than something he could build. Clara looked at broken things and saw what they still had in them. She looked at a rotted wagon cover and saw salvageable canvas. She looked at a cracked harness strap and saw repairable leather. She looked at a half-ruined ranch on a dry Wyoming plain and saw good bones, good land, a real future that nobody was bothering to build. She wasn't optimistic. That's an important distinction. Optimism is when you believe things will work out without particular evidence. What Clara had was more demanding than that. It was the willingness to actually look at the evidence, understand what was repairable and what wasn't, and commit fully to the work. That's not a quality you're born with. She'd built it over 11 years of daily practice, in a canvas shop in Dayton, Ohio, learning by looking at failures and understanding them and not flinching away. It was a skill like any other skill, developed through repetition, through getting it wrong, through the particular education of working on something until it held. She was not a perfect person. She was not always patient and not always right, and there were moments when the accumulated weight of being underestimated made her shorter with people than she should have been. And she knew it, and she corrected it when she noticed, and sometimes she noticed too late. She had made repair calculations that didn't come out the way she'd planned, and had fixed her errors without advertising them. She had, on 2 separate occasions, given Tom Wicker feedback that was technically accurate and tonally harder than it needed to be, and had gone back the next day to straighten it. She was a person. She was a person who had decided at 23 that she was going to develop a specific skill and do it well and build something from it, and had done exactly that, and the doing had required all of her, the capable parts and the difficult parts, and everything in between. The valley recognized her eventually, not in a moment and not universally, and not without the particular slowness that characterizes places that have made up their minds and then have to unmake them. But recognition came, through the practical acknowledgement of people who had brought her their broken equipment and received it back working. Through Dorothea Marsh and Frances Briggs and Nell Carver and Ingrid Sola, who built their own small versions of competence and self-sufficiency from what they learned at the barn workspace. Through the railroad account that held through 2 construction seasons and expanded. Through the numbers in a ledger that told the story more plainly than words. And through the name on the front gate of Hale's Crossing, which Gideon changed that summer, painting it himself on a flat piece of cedar board that he hung on the gatepost with the specific care of a man who understands when a thing is worth doing properly. Hale and Whitmore. It was a business name. It was whatever else they made of it, over time, the way things are made. Imperfectly, without guarantee, through daily effort and the accumulated weight of choosing each other consistently. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was a beginning.